The Reaper's Choice. There are few fates in the grim annals of the 41st millennium more terrible than watching your sons die by degrees, consumed by plagues that mock the very resilience you forged into their bones. Mortarion, Primarch of the 14th Legion, the Death Guard, had believed his warriors beyond such weakness. For 2 centuries they had endured toxins that would fell lesser astartes, breathed poison as easily as air, and marched through chemical hellscapes that reduced other legions to corpses. Yet here, in the howling madness of the warp, even his sons were failing. The fleet hung motionless in the imperium, 14 vessels trapped like insects in amber. No stars shone through the viewports, only the roiling chaos of unreality that pressed against the Geller fields with patient, inexorable hunger. The Death Guard had been en route to Terra, answering Warmaster Horus's call to strike at the heart of the Imperium when the warp storms had claimed them. That had been 17 days ago, though time held little meaning in this place where cause preceded effect and madness wore the mask of logic. Mortarion stood upon the bridge of his flagship, the Endurance, his pale features carved from stone as he watched his fleet die. Through the Vox channels came reports that each brought fresh horror. On the destroyer, Putrid Glory, 3 companies had succumbed to a wasting sickness that bloated their bellies with corpse gas. The cruiser Mortis Consecrus had gone silent entirely, its last transmission a scream of static filled with what might have been laughter. Across his fleet, warriors who had never known defeat were falling to diseases that defied comprehension. The destroyer plague, his apothecaries called it, though they spoke the name in whispers. It was like nothing in their archives, nothing that their gene-forged constitutions could resist. The sickness began as a creeping weakness, a fatigue that settled into the bones. Then came the swelling, the grotesque distension of flesh as unseen parasites multiplied within. The final stage was merciful only in its brevity. Madness, followed by death, followed by something worse than death, as the corpses rose again, animated by purposes that served no mortal will. My lord. The voice belonged to Captain Garrow of the 7th Company, one of the few officers who had maintained his composure as the fleet descended into nightmare. His armor bore the scars of recent fighting, for even aboard the Endurance, they had been forced to put down squads of their own brothers when the plague claimed them. First Captain Typhon requests your immediate presence in the Apothecarion. Mortarion's jaw tightened. Callus Typhon, his most trusted lieutenant, the Terran-born warrior who had served at his side since the early days of the Great Crusade. If Typhon had summoned him to the medical bays, it meant the plague had reached even the inner circles of his command. The Primarch nodded once, his silence speaking volumes that words could not convey. The corridors of the Endurance echoed with sounds no imperial vessel should contain. Behind sealed blast doors, the infected shrieked and gibbered in tongues that hurt to hear. Servo skulls drifted overhead, their mechanical voices reciting litanies of the dead with mechanical precision. 732 battle brothers lost, 891 in various stages of infection. The numbers climbed with each hour, each report another knife thrust into Mortarion's hearts. The Apothecarion reeked of death and worse things. Here, Chief Apothecary Vadon and his subordinates fought a losing war against corruption itself. Mortarion entered to find his healers hunched over specimens that bore only passing resemblance to Astartes' physiology. The plague twisted flesh into new configurations, creating appendages that served no earthly function and organs that pulsed with their own diseased life. "My Primarch," Vadon said, without looking up from his work. His voice carried the exhaustion of a man who had seen too much and understood too little. The contagion defies all analysis. It is not bacterial, not viral, not any pathogen our sciences recognize. It acts upon the very concept of life itself, rewriting the fundamental structures that define existence. Mortarion approached the central table, where a death guard lay strapped down, his once proud armor split open to accommodate the grotesque changes racking his form. The warrior's eyes rolled in their sockets, pupils dilated with fever madness, yet when they focused on his primarch, there remained a spark of recognition, of desperate hope. Can you save us, my lord?" The words bubbled through lips that wept pus. "Please, I don't want to become what the others became." Before Mortarion could respond, the blast doors sealed behind him with a resonant clang. The Primarch turned, his hand instinctively reaching for silence, the massive scythe that never left his side. Standing in the doorway was callous Typhon, but something fundamental had changed in his first captain. The man's armor had taken on a greenish cast, and his breathing came in rattling gasps that spoke of lungs filled with more than air. "My lord," Typhon said, his voice carrying harmonics that had not been there before, "I bring word of salvation." Mortarion's eyes narrowed. In 2 centuries of warfare, he had learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished truth from deception, ally from enemy. Every instinct screamed danger, yet Typhon was still his son, still the warrior who had stood beside him on 100 battlefields. "Speak plainly, Callus. What salvation can there be in this place of madness?" Typhon smiled, and that expression was wrong on a dozen levels that Mortarion could not name. "I have been contacted by powers that offer us deliverance from this plague. They do not seek our destruction, my lord. They seek our transformation, our evolution." The temperature in the apothecarium dropped several degrees. Ice crystals formed on the metal surfaces as something vast and patient turned its attention toward the Endurance. Mortarion felt it then, the weight of an intelligence so alien that his mind recoiled from contact. Yet with that presence came whispers, seductive promises that slithered through his thoughts like serpents made of sound. "Your sons need not die, Reaper of Men. They can live forever, freed from the weaknesses of mortal flesh. All I ask is that you kneel, that you accept the gifts I offer so freely." The voice belonged to no creature of the material realm. It spoke of gardens where disease bloomed eternal, of plagues that brought not death but transformation, of a paradise built from the very concept of decay. Mortarion saw visions then. His death guard transformed into something beyond life and death, invincible champions who felt no pain and knew no defeat. He saw worlds cleansed of their populations, then reborn as breeding grounds for new forms of existence. He saw himself seated upon a throne of bone and brass, a demon prince ruling over legions of the reborn dead. The vision lasted only seconds, but in that time, Mortarion understood the true scope of what was being offered. Power beyond imagination. Victory guaranteed. All he need do was surrender everything that defined him as human, as imperial, as loyal to the dream his father had died to build. No. The word escaped his lips as barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of finality. Around him, the temperature plummeted further as the presence withdrew slightly, surprised by the rejection of its gifts. Typhon's expression shifted from confidence to confusion to something approaching rage. "My lord, you cannot refuse. The fleet dies around us. Our brothers suffer agonies beyond description. This power offers them peace, offers them purpose greater than anything the corpse emperor could provide." Mortarion's hand closed around Silence's haft. The familiar weight of the weapon grounding him in purpose that transcended the moment's desperation. I have seen what your patron offers, Callus. It is not salvation. It is damnation, dressed in the raiment of hope. My sons chose to follow me into war, not into slavery, to powers that regard them as meat for the grinder. Then you condemn them to death, Typhon snarled, his form beginning to swell as the gifts he had already accepted manifested more fully. You condemn all of us to meaningless extinction when we could have immortality. The Primarch raised silence, its blade gleaming with the pale light that had given him his epithet. Better to die as we lived, free men serving a cause greater than ourselves, than to exist forever as puppets dancing to an alien tune. You have made your choice, Callus Typhon. Now I make mine. The battle that followed was brief but vicious. Typhon had indeed been changed by whatever power had claimed him, his strength enhanced beyond even that of a first captain of the Legion's Astartes. Yet Mortarion was a Primarch, and more than that, he was driven by a fury born not of corruption, but of betrayal. When silence carved through Typhon's mutated form, sending him crashing into the apothecarian's machinery, the victory felt hollow. This had been his son, his trusted lieutenant, reduced to a puppet of forces that cared nothing for the brotherhood they destroyed. Typhon's death rattle filled the chamber as his corrupted form began to dissolve. Yet even in defeat, he managed a final taunt. You cannot save them. Without the gifts, without the power, they will all die. Mortarion stood over the dissolving remains of his first captain, his breath misting in the frigid air as the alien presence withdrew to consider this unexpected defiance. Around him, his remaining officers stared in shock and confusion, their faith in their Primarch warring with the evidence of their own mortality. The plague continued to spread. His sons continued to die. And somewhere in the howling void of the warp, powers beyond reckoning plotted new ways to claim what had been denied them. Yet Mortarion, the Pale King, the Reaper of Men, felt something he had not experienced in decades, the cold fire of purpose, uncompromised by expedience or despair. He had chosen death over corruption, integrity over survival. Now came the harder task, finding a third option that his enemies hadn't considered, for he was a Primarch of the Emperor, and Primarchs did not surrender. They found a way. The battle for the soul of the 14th Legion had only just begun. The Emperor's silent gift death, Mortarion discovered, was not the ending he had expected. As the destroyer plague finally claimed his enhanced physiology, as his twin hearts stuttered and his gene-forged organs began their final shutdown, he found himself suspended in a place that existed between heartbeats, between thoughts, between the moment of drawing breath and releasing it. Here, in this space that was neither life nor death, the universe revealed secrets that no living mind was meant to comprehend. The fever had taken him 3 hours after his confrontation with Typhon. Despite his Primarch constitution, despite the genetic modifications that made him proof against any terrestrial toxin, the warp-born plague had finally found purchase in his flesh. He had felt it first as a tremor in his left hand, then as a burning sensation that spread along his neural pathways like fire consuming dry kindling. By the time his equerry had found him collapsed in his private chambers, Mortarion was already beyond the reach of conventional medicine. Now he floated in darkness that pulsed with its own inner light, watching as fragments of memory and possibility swirled around him like leaves in an autumn wind. Some belonged to him. Scenes from his youth on Barbarous, the first time he had taken up arms against the overlords, the moment he had knelt before his father and sworn the oath of loyalty that had defined his existence for 2 centuries. Others were alien to his experience, yet somehow familiar, visions of events that had not yet come to pass, might never come to pass, or existed only in the realm of potential. Among these swirling fragments, one presence made itself known. Not the alien hunger of Nurgle, not the seductive whispers of the warp's chaotic inhabitants, but something that resonated with the very core of his being. Golden light pierced the darkness, and in that radiance, Mortarion saw his father as he truly was. Not the remote, enigmatic figure who had claimed him on Barbarous, but the being who had sacrificed everything mortal about himself in service to a dream that transcended individual existence. The Emperor's voice, when it came, carried no sound. It spoke directly to Mortarion's soul, bypassing the crude mechanisms of hearing and language to communicate in the pure currency of understanding. My son, my poor, tormented son, you have chosen the harder path. Mortarion tried to respond, to voice the questions that had burned in his heart for decades, but found himself without form, without substance to shape into words. Instead, his thoughts themselves became his voice, his emotions the medium of communication. Father, why did you never tell us? Why did you hide the truth about what we face? The golden radiance shifted, and suddenly Mortarion was elsewhere, witnessing scenes that unfolded with the crystalline clarity of absolute truth. He saw the Emperor in the depths of Terran laboratories, working with sciences that predated human civilization by eons. He watched as his father made bargains with entities whose very existence was anathema to mortal comprehension, trading away pieces of his own humanity to secure the knowledge needed to create the Primarchs. He witnessed the moment when the infant Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy, saw the anguish that racked the Emperor's features as his sons were torn from him by forces he had thought himself capable of controlling. The truth would have destroyed you. The Emperor's voice carried undertones of infinite weariness. You and your brothers were created to be weapons against the darkness, but weapons must believe in their purpose. If you had known from the beginning what powers sought to claim you, what prices had already been paid for your existence, you would have been paralyzed by doubt. Or worse, you would have sought to make your own bargains with forces that regard honor as weakness and love as folly. The visions shifted again, showing Mortarion glimpses of alternate paths, roads not taken that led to endings both triumphant and terrible. In one, he saw himself embracing Nurgle's gifts, becoming a demon prince who ruled over plague worlds where suffering was the only constant. In another, he remained loyal but ignorant, a faithful son who served without understanding until chaos found other ways to claim his legion. But there was a third path, narrow as a blade's edge and twice as perilous, where knowledge and loyalty combined to forge something new. You possess a gift, my son, that even I didn't foresee when I crafted your genetic matrix. The Emperor's presence grew stronger, more focused, as if his attention were being drawn from distant battlefields to concentrate on this moment. Your hatred of Psychers, your revulsion at the powers of the warp, these were not flaws but protections. You built walls in your mind so strong that even the gods of chaos cannot easily breach them. But walls can become prisons, and now you must choose whether to remain safe and powerless, or to tear down those barriers and claim the strength you need to save your sons. Mortarion felt something stirring within him, a power that had always been present but carefully suppressed. He had been born with the same psychic potential as his brothers, the same capacity to manipulate the forces of the imperium that made Magnus so formidable and Lorgar so dangerous. But where they had embraced their gifts, he had rejected them, viewing psychic power as corruption waiting to happen. Now, with his legion dying around him and conventional medicine proving worthless against warp-spawned plagues, he began to understand that his father's design had been more subtle than he had ever imagined. "Show me," he thought, and felt the Emperor's approval wash over him like warmth from a distant star. The first manifestation came as fire, but not the consuming flames of destruction that he had expected. This was purification made manifest, a blazing radiance that burned away corruption without touching the pure essence beneath. Mortarion watched in fascination as the golden flames danced through his astral form, searing away the taint of the destroyer plague, leaving him cleansed but fundamentally changed. Where before his psychic potential had been locked away, now it flowed freely, controlled not by rigid suppression, but by iron discipline and unwavering purpose. "This is your inheritance," the Emperor said, his voice beginning to fade as other duties called him back to the material realm. "Not the corruption your enemies offer, but purification itself. Use it wisely, my son. Your brothers will need your example in the trials to come." The connection dissolved, leaving Mortarion alone in the space between heartbeats. But he was no longer dying. The purifying flames continued to burn within him, not consuming but cleansing, not destroying but renewing. When his consciousness finally returned to his physical form, he found himself lying on the deck of his private chambers, his armor cracked, and his flesh marked by the passage of otherworldly fire. But alive. More than alive, transformed, Captain Garrow was the first to find him, drawn by reports of strange lights emanating from the Primarch's quarters. The veteran warrior's face went pale when he saw his lord rising from what should have been a deathbed, wreathed in flickering auroras of gold and silver that made the very air shimmer with potential. "My lord?" Garrow's voice carried uncertainty tinged with hope. "The plague. We thought—" Mortarion tested his limbs, feeling strength flow through muscles that had been racked with corruption only hours before. The purifying fire still burned within him, a gentle warmth that promised protection against any taint the warp might spawn. "The plague is ended, Nathaniel, at least for me, and perhaps for others." He extended his hand toward his captain, willing the flames to manifest not as destruction, but as healing. Golden light flowed from his fingertips, washing over Garrow's armor and flesh with the gentleness of sunlight on still water. The veteran warrior gasped as minor wounds sealed themselves, as fatigue lifted from his shoulders like a weight removed, as the subtle corruption that had begun to take hold of his system burned away without pain or trauma. "How is this possible?" Garrow breathed, staring at his own hands as if seeing them for the first time. Mortarion's expression remained carefully neutral, though inwardly he marveled at the ease with which the power responded to his will. 2 centuries of rigid self-control, of denying his psychic heritage, had created mental disciplines that most psychers never achieved. Where they struggled with raw power and chaotic emotion, he channeled purification itself with the precision of a master craftsman. "My father has many gifts," he said simply. "Some of them take time to manifest. Gather the captains, Nathaniel, all who remain uninfected, and those in the early stages of contamination. It is time to discover whether this blessing can be shared." Over the next several hours, as word spread through the fleet that their Primarch had not only survived the plague, but found a way to combat it, Mortarion began the delicate work of extending his protection to others. The process was exhausting, requiring him to touch each warrior individually and guide the purifying flames through their systems with surgical precision. Too little power and the corruption remained. Too much and the cure became as deadly as the disease. But it worked. One by one, the Death Guard began to recover, their enhanced physiology reasserting itself as the warp-born taint was burned away. Not all could be saved. Those too far gone in the final stages of mutation were beyond any mortal help. But enough survived to maintain hope. Companies that had been written off as lost began reporting in, their captains' voices carrying wonder as they described warriors rising from plague beds, whole and unmarked. Yet even as he worked to save his sons, Mortarion was conscious of the price being paid. Each use of the purifying flames drew something from him, a subtle diminishment that he felt in his bones. The power was not infinite, not without cost. His father's gift came with the same terrible arithmetic that governed all things in this universe. For every blessing, a sacrifice. For every salvation, a price that must be paid. Standing on the bridge of the Endurance, as the last of the medical emergencies were resolved, watching his fleet begin to move again, as crews who had given up hope returned to their duties with renewed purpose, Mortarion understood that he had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. He was no longer simply a Primarch who happened to possess psychic abilities he refused to use. He had become something new, a weapon forged specifically to fight the corruption that spawned in the warp's darkest depths. The war ahead would test that weapon to its limits. But for the first time since the fleet had been trapped in this nightmare realm, Mortarion allowed himself to feel something approaching hope. His sons would live. They would fight. And when they faced the powers of chaos again, they would do so not as victims, but as bearers of a flame that no darkness could extinguish. The destroyer plague had been meant to break them. Instead, it had revealed what they were truly capable of becoming. The cleansing fire war had come to the Death Guard fleet, not from an external enemy but from within, brother against brother in the dark spaces between stars. The corruption that Mortarion had thought purged from his flagship proved more tenacious than any terrestrial disease. While he had saved those he could reach directly, the infection had already taken root in the vessels furthest from the Endurance, spreading like a malignant cancer through ships where his purifying flames could not reach. Captain Erlen of the 12th Company brought the first reports of open rebellion. His Vox transmission crackled with static, and something worse, the sound of bolter fire echoing through his vessel's corridors as Death Guard turned their weapons upon their own brothers. "My lord, the Harbinger of Decay reports total corruption of their command structure. They're demanding we lower our shields and submit to the gifts of their new patron. Captain Mortug has ordered weapons training on our position." Mortarion stood on the Endurance's bridge, watching tactical displays that painted a picture of his worst fears made manifest. Of his 14 vessels, 6 showed clear signs of total corruption, their crews transformed into something that bore only passing resemblance to the warriors they had once been. 3 more flickered between green and amber on the tactical board, their loyalty uncertain as internal battles raged through their decks. Only 5 ships remained fully under his control, their crews protected by his direct intervention or their own stubborn resistance to the warp's influence. "Signal all loyal vessels," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Formation, Barbarous 7. We purge the corrupted ships first, then cleanse those still fighting for their souls." The formation that bore the name of his homeworld had been designed for the most desperate of circumstances. Legion vessels turning their guns upon each other in battles where mercy was a luxury the galaxy could not afford. Mortarion had hoped never to use it. Yet here they were, preparing to burn away the diseased limbs to save the body. The first engagement came as the loyal destroyer, Pale Maiden, moved to intercept the corrupted cruiser, Putrid Majesty. What should have been a contest between unequal forces became something far more complex, as the laws of physics seemed to bend around the plague ship. Mortarion watched through the tactical displays as shells that should have pierced the cruiser's armor instead burst harmlessly against barriers that glowed with diseased luminescence. "My lord," called Chief Navigator Athrin from his station, his augmetic eye whirring as it processed data that defied conventional analysis. "The corrupted vessels are using warp-spawned defenses. Their hulls register temperatures that should melt adamantium, yet they remain intact. They're not operating under natural law anymore." Mortarion nodded grimly. He had expected as much. Nurgle's gifts came with their own forms of protection, turning his once proud vessels into floating hives of corruption that obeyed different rules than those governing the material realm. But if the enemy had supernatural advantages, then he would meet them with power drawn from the same source. "Athrin, plot a course for direct engagement with the Putrid Majesty. Navigation, all power to forward shields and engines." The Primarch's hands moved to the shrine that dominated the bridge's center, where he had placed the remnants of Typhon's corrupted armor as both trophy and warning. "It's time to test whether purification burns brighter than corruption." The Endurance accelerated toward the enemy vessel, her engines blazing with fury as Mortarion reached out with his newfound abilities. Golden fire began to emanate from his form, spreading through the ship's superstructure like veins of molten light. Where the flames touched, the vessel's machine spirit seemed to awaken from ancient slumber, its sensors becoming sharper, its weapons more accurate, its armor more resilient against the unnatural attacks that peppered their advance. The battle that followed defied every convention of void warfare that Mortarion had learned in 2 centuries of campaigning. The Putrid Majesty unleashed ordnance that writhed through space like living things, shells that screamed with voices that belonged to no mortal throat. In return, the Endurance's weapons blazed with purifying radiance, each shot carrying a fragment of Mortarion's will made manifest. Where the cleansing fire met corruption, the results were spectacular. Demon engines dissolving into component atoms, plague-spawned defenses burning away like mist before the dawn. Yet even as the flagship carved through enemy resistance, Mortarion's attention was drawn to a new threat approaching from the fleet's periphery. The tactical displays showed a vessel that registered no life signs, yet moved with purpose and intelligence. As it drew closer, he recognized the hull configuration of the Death Guard frigate Terminus Est, but something fundamental had changed about the ship. Its armor had taken on a greenish cast, and structures that served no mechanical function had sprouted from its hull like tumors given form. "Hail the Terminus Est," Mortarion commanded, though he already suspected what response would come. The Vox channel opened with a sound like laughter filtered through diseased lungs. When the voice emerged from the speakers, it carried harmonics that made the bridge crew step back in instinctive revulsion. It was Typhon, but transformed beyond anything human recognition might achieve. "My lord and father," the voice said, each word dripping with mockery that cut deeper than any blade. "How gracious of you to join us in our moment of transcendence. I had hoped my death might convince you to reconsider your position, but I see that even witnessing your own son's destruction could not overcome your stubborn pride." Mortarion's grip tightened on Silence's haft, the weapon's edge gleaming with anticipation. The thing speaking was not Typhon, not any more. Whatever had worn his first captain's form in the Apothecarion had been merely a shadow of what now commanded the Terminus Est. This was Typhon, reborn as something that existed simultaneously in the material realm and the warp's depths, a demon prince whose very presence corrupted reality around him. "You were never my son," Mortarion replied, his words carrying across the void with terrible finality. "A son does not betray his father's trust. A son does not lead his brothers into damnation for the promise of power. You are merely a puppet wearing familiar flesh." The laughter that followed shook both vessels, transmitted not through vox channels but through the imperium itself. "Puppet? Oh, my dear father, you understand so little. I am more than I ever was in life, blessed with gifts beyond your comprehension. I am Typhus now, herald of Nurgle, master of the plague fleet that will carry our grandfather's love to every world in the galaxy." The Terminus Est began its attack run, but this was no conventional void engagement. As it approached, the space around both vessels began to change, reality warping to accommodate powers that had no place in the material universe. Mortarion felt the change as physical pain, his enhanced senses recoiling from phenomena that violated every natural law. "All crew, prepare for psychic assault," he commanded, then reached out with his own abilities to counter what was coming. The battle that followed was fought on multiple levels simultaneously. In the material realm, two vessels exchanged fire with weapons designed to crack planetary crusts. In the warp, two opposing forces of will clashed like titans, each seeking to impose their version of reality on the space around them. Mortarion's purifying flames met Typhus's corrupting influence in displays of power that would have been visible from neighboring star systems. Through it all, the rest of the Death Guard civil war continued to rage. Captain Garrow led boarding actions against corrupted vessels whose crew had been transformed into walking plague vectors. Captain Erlen sacrificed his ship's life support to prevent a demon engine from teleporting into his bridge. On the destroyer Pale Maiden, Sergeant Hakour held a critical corridor for 6 hours against waves of corruption-spawned horrors, finally falling when his ammunition ran out and he chose to trigger the ship's reactor rather than allow the enemy to claim another vessel. Each loss cut into Mortarion's soul like a physical wound. These were his sons, warriors he had trained and led for decades, reduced to civil war because he had failed to see the corruption growing in his own ranks. The knowledge that their deaths were necessary, that mercy would only allow the infection to spread, provided no comfort as he watched loyal Death Guard die to stop the advance of their corrupted brothers. The duel with Typhus reached its climax as both vessels closed to boarding range. Neither commander trusted victory to void weapons alone. This was a contest that demanded personal resolution. Mortarion teleported across the gap between ships, his psychic flames forming a protective barrier that allowed him to survive transition through space, corrupted by warp energy. He materialized on the bridge of the Terminus Est to find himself in a chamber that belonged more to nightmare than reality. The walls wept with organic substances that pulsed with their own diseased life. The air itself was thick with spores that would have killed any mortal within seconds. And at the center of it all stood Typhus, no longer recognizably human, his form swollen with the gifts of his patron god. "Welcome to my new domain," the demon prince said, his voice now emanating from multiple sources, as the ship itself had become an extension of his corrupted essence. "Here, you will learn that your father's gifts are pale shadows compared to what Grandfather Nurgle offers." The battle that followed was brutal beyond description. Typhus fought with strength that transcended his physical form, drawing power from the warp itself to fuel attacks that should have been impossible. His claws, when they found their mark, carried diseases that could kill even a Primarch. His voice, when raised in incantation, summoned lesser demons that materialized from the ship's corrupted superstructure. Yet Mortarion had advantages that his enemy had not anticipated. 2 centuries of disciplined self-control had created mental barriers that even demon princes found difficult to breach. His purifying flames burned with intensity born from absolute conviction, and every blow he struck carried the weight of betrayed trust and righteous fury. When silence finally carved through Typhus's defenses, the demon's destruction was not death but banishment. His form dissolved into component energies that were drawn back into the warp, screaming promises of return and revenge. The Terminus Est, suddenly bereft of the will that had animated it, began to tear itself apart as competing forces of corruption sought to claim dominance. Mortarion teleported back to the Endurance just as the frigate's reactor went critical, taking with it the last organized center of resistance among the corrupted vessels. The remaining plague ships, bereft of their leader's coordination, were hunted down one by the loyal Death Guard. Some surrendered, their crews begging for the purification that only their Primarch could provide. Others fought to the last, choosing destruction over cleansing. When the battle finally ended, barely half the original fleet remained. Of the warriors who survived, fewer still bore no taint from their encounter with corruption. Yet those who remained had been tested in ways that forge legends from mere mortals. They had faced the seductive promises of chaos and chosen duty over power, loyalty over survival, purification over corruption. Standing on the bridge of his flagship as damage reports flowed in from across the surviving vessels, Mortarion felt the weight of what they had accomplished and what it had cost. His legion was smaller now, but it was also purer, tempered by trials that would have broken lesser warriors. The Death Guard who remained were no longer simply soldiers in humanity's armies. They were something new, bearers of cleansing fire who could walk into the heart of corruption itself and emerge unmarked. The war ahead would test that purity in ways he could not yet imagine. But for now, it was enough that they had survived their first trial and emerged stronger for the ordeal. The galaxy waited, unaware that one of its supposed betrayers had chosen a different path entirely. Brothers in Shadow Word travel swiftly through the imperium, carried on currents of psychic energy that bind the galaxy's most powerful souls in webs of shared experience. When a Primarch defies the gods themselves, when a legion thought lost to corruption burns away its taint with purifying fire, the reverberations echo through the warp like thunder across an infinite sky. The traitor Primarchs, scattered across a dozen worlds in pursuit of their own campaigns against the Imperium, felt those reverberations as both warning and challenge. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, who had traded his soul for the promise of victory, stood in the stratagium of his flagship Vengeful Spirit when the first reports arrived. The vessel hung in the void above Moloch, where his forces prepared for the next phase of their advance toward Terra. Around him, the ship's officers and his most trusted lieutenants waited as he processed information that threatened to unravel carefully laid plans. "Mortarion has purged 6 vessels of his own fleet," reported Ezekiel Abaddon, his voice carrying disbelief that bordered on accusation. "The Death Guard are fighting a civil war in the middle of our advance. Worse, our sources indicate he rejected direct communion with one of the powers. He chose damnation over ascension." The War Master's expression remained carefully neutral as he studied the tactical displays that showed the reduced strength of the 14th Legion. Mortarion had always been the most reluctant of his brothers to embrace the necessities of their rebellion. Where others saw the wisdom in accepting whatever advantages the warp offered, the Death Lord had clung to notions of independence that belonged to a more innocent age. Yet Horus had counted on that very stubbornness, believing it would make Mortarion a more reliable tool once properly motivated. Perhaps, Horus said at length, his words measured and precise, my brother has given us a greater gift than he realizes. A Primarch who can resist the influence of the dark gods, who can cleanse corruption from his own ranks. Such a weapon could prove invaluable when properly directed. Mortarion's strength was always his incorruptible will. If he has found a way to weaponize that quality, we may have gained more than we lost. Abaddon's scarred features twisted with confusion. You speak as though this rebellion serves our cause, my lord. He has reduced his legion's strength by half and proclaimed his independence from powers that have offered us victory itself. Horus turned from the tactical displays to regard his first captain with eyes that held depths no mortal mind should contain. The gifts of chaos had made him more than human, but they had also made him something less, trading simple loyalty for complex calculations that weighed souls against strategic advantage. Victory requires many tools, Ezekiel. Some must be sharp enough to cut through any defense. Others must be pure enough to touch what corruption cannot reach. If Mortarion believes he has found a third path between loyalty and damnation, I would be foolish not to explore what uses such a path might serve. Far from the vengeful spirit Strategium, in the ruins of Prospero, where crystalline spires still glowed with residual psychic energy, Magnus the Red felt his brother's struggle as a physical pain that resonated through his own wounded soul. The Crimson King sat in meditation among the wreckage of his great library, his single remaining eye focused on visions that unfolded across the spectrum of possibility and regret. The psychic contact, when it came, required only the slightest effort of will. Through the warp's chaotic currents, Magnus reached out to touch the mind of his brother, finding there patterns of resistance and purification that he recognized with bitter familiarity. Mortarion. The name carried with it undertones of shared pain, of choices made in desperation that had led to consequences neither could have foreseen. I felt your defiance echo through the imperium. Tell me, brother, have you found a way to turn aside from the paths that lead to damnation? The response came slowly, filtered through psychic barriers that had been forged in the crucible of recent trauma. Mortarion's mental voice carried exhaustion and wariness, but beneath those surface emotions lay something Magnus had not expected to find: hope. Magnus, I had thought you lost to the Changer's influence entirely. How do you speak to me now with such clarity? Mortarion's thoughts were edged with suspicion, the hard-won wisdom of one who had learned to question every gift offered freely. The taint runs deep, but it has not yet claimed all of me. Fragments remain, shards of the scholar I once was before pride and desperation led me to make bargains with powers that view knowledge as another form of slavery. Magnus's psychic presence flickered with possibilities as he spoke, aspects of his nature coming into focus and dissolving like reflections in disturbed water. What you have achieved, this purification you have wrought, could it be shared? Could others find redemption through your example? The silence that followed stretched across light years and through dimensions, where time held no meaning. When Mortarion finally responded, his thoughts carried the weight of careful consideration and painful honesty. I do not know if what saved my sons can save others. The fire that burns in me was awakened by proximity to death and paid for with sacrifices I barely comprehend. But if there is wisdom in my path, brother, it is this: the gods offer power, but they demand worship. True strength comes from within, from purpose that transcends individual desire. The connection between them began to fade as the warp's currents shifted and other powers took notice of their communication. Yet before contact was lost entirely, Magnus managed one final exchange. "I will remember your words, Mortarion. When the time comes to choose between power and principle, your example may provide the guidance I need. And I yours, Magnus. Tread carefully in the realm of the Changer. Not all changes can be undone." On the world of Talon, where the Iron Warriors prosecuted a siege that had already lasted 17 months, Perturabo received word of his brother's rebellion with emotions that surprised him with their complexity. The Lord of Iron stood on the command deck of his mobile fortress, watching as his artillery reduced another section of the enemy's defensive line to molten slag. Around him, the machinery of war continued its inexorable advance, servo skulls calculating firing solutions, and tech adepts monitoring ammunition expenditure with mechanical precision. "Mortarion has chosen to walk alone," reported Warsmith Honso, his voice carrying professional respect for an enemy who had proven more cunning than anticipated. "Our intelligence suggests his reduced legion remains combat effective, but their tactical doctrine has shifted toward counter-corruption operations. They've become specialized demon hunters." Perturabo's expression remained fixed on the siege displays, but something in his stance suggested satisfaction rather than disappointment. "My brother was always too proud to accept gifts he had not earned through his own effort. If he has found strength in that pride, perhaps he has chosen more wisely than the rest of us." The observation hung in the air like smoke from the artillery bombardment that continued to shake the fortress's hull. None of Perturabo's officers dared to ask whether their lord considered his own choices wise or foolish. The Iron Warriors had committed themselves to a path of endless siege and bitter warfare, trading their souls for the tools needed to tear down everything their father had built. Yet watching the tactical displays that showed their enemies' stubborn resistance, Perturabo could not help but wonder whether Mortarion had found something they had all lost in their rush to embrace whatever advantages the warp offered. Far across the galaxy, in the gladiatorial pits of Concata, where blood flowed like rivers and skulls piled high enough to blot out the sun, Angron felt his brother's defiance as an affront that demanded immediate and violent response. The Red Angel's transformation was nearly complete, his last remnants of humanity burned away in the furnace of Khorne's rage. When word came of Mortarion's purification of his own legion, the sound that emerged from Angron's throat was less laughter than the roar of a beast whose territory had been challenged. "He thinks himself pure," Angron snarled, his words accompanied by the wet sound of gore dripping from his weapons onto the arena floor. "The Pale One believes he has found strength in weakness, victory in denial. We shall teach him otherwise. We shall show him what real power looks like when it is unleashed without restraint or hesitation." The World Eaters who surrounded their Primarch took up his cry with enthusiasm born from genetic conditioning and chemical enhancement. To them, Mortarion's choice represented not wisdom, but cowardice, the refusal to embrace the strength that could make them invincible in battle. They would seek him out, these berserker champions, and prove through violence that corruption was merely another word for evolution. Yet even as they roared their approval, some among them remembered a time when the Death Guard had been their allies, reliable warriors who could be counted upon to hold the line no matter what horrors they faced. Those memories, fleeting and painful, suggested that perhaps their former allies had found something worth defending more fiercely than simple survival. On the pleasure world of Laudamida, where the Emperor's children pursued perfection through sensation that transcended mortal comprehension, Fulgrim received news of his brother's rebellion with something approaching artistic appreciation. The Phoenician reclined among silks that shifted color with his breathing, his perfect features unmarred by the concerns that plagued lesser beings. "How fascinating," he murmured, his voice carrying harmonics that made nearby servitors shiver with unwanted pleasure. Mortarion has chosen the path of denial, rejecting transcendence in favor of what? Moral superiority, the comfort of principles that serve no purpose beyond their own preservation. The demon who served as his constant companion, wearing the face of a musician whose talent had been consumed centuries ago, leaned forward with interest that glittered like broken glass. "Shall we arrange a demonstration of his error, my lord? A symphony of sensation that would show him what he has rejected?" Fulgrim's smile was a work of art that would have driven mortal observers mad with its terrible beauty. "In time, beloved. For now, let us simply observe how long his purity can withstand the universe's inexorable tendency toward corruption. All things must be perfected eventually, even stubborn brothers who mistake stagnation for virtue." But it was in the cathedral ship Fidelitas Lex, where the word-bearers pursued their crusade to bring truth to an unenlightened galaxy, that news of Mortarion's defiance met with the greatest fury. Lorgar Aurelian, the Urizen, whose words had first opened the path to powers beyond mortal comprehension, stood before the great altar, where he conducted his daily devotions to the Chaos gods. The golden light that had once crowned his brow was gone, replaced by shadows that whispered secrets too terrible for human understanding. "Blasphemy," Lorgar breathed, his voice carrying such venom that the very air seemed to recoil from his words. "To reject the gifts of the true powers is not nobility, but the worst form of heresy. Mortarion denies divine truth itself, choosing ignorance over enlightenment, bondage over freedom." The dark apostles who surrounded their Primarch murmured prayers that called upon forces older than human civilization. To them, Mortarion's choice represented more than simple rebellion. It was an active rejection of the universal principles that governed existence itself. The Death Lord had placed himself outside the natural order, attempting to forge a path that served neither loyalty nor apostasy, but some impossible third alternative. "We shall make him an example," Lorgar continued, his words taking on the cadence of prophecy as he spoke. "His legion shall be brought to understanding, his warriors shown the futility of resistance to powers that shape reality itself. Mortarion shall kneel before the altars of truth, or he shall burn in fires that never die and never grant the mercy of destruction." The proclamation echoed through the cathedral ship's halls, carrying with it promises of retribution that transcended merely physical warfare. The word-bearers would seek out their wayward brother, not simply to defeat him in battle, but to prove through his destruction that no one could stand against the fundamental forces of change and decay that ruled the universe. Yet even as the traitor Primarchs planned their responses to Mortarion's defiance, deeper currents moved through the warp itself. The Chaos gods, ancient beyond measure and patient beyond mortal comprehension, felt their carefully laid plans disrupted by a single act of willful resistance. They had counted on the inevitability of corruption, the certainty that all mortals would eventually choose power over principle when faced with truly impossible odds. Mortarion's choice represented more than simple rebellion. It was proof that alternatives existed to the binary choice between loyalty and damnation. His purified legion stood as evidence that strength could be found in sources other than the warp's chaotic energies, that warriors could face corruption itself and emerge not merely unbroken, but actively stronger for the trial. The galaxy held its breath, unaware that one Primarch's moment of moral clarity had introduced variables into calculations that had been proceeding along predictable lines for millennia. The Horus Heresy would continue, brother would fight brother, and the Imperium would bleed from wounds that might never heal. But now there was a third faction in the war, one that belonged neither to loyal nor traitor, serving purposes that transcended the simple politics of rebellion. The Death Guard, purified in the crucible of their own civil war, prepared for whatever trials awaited them. They had chosen their path, not in ignorance of its costs, but with full knowledge that the road ahead would demand sacrifices beyond counting. Yet they had also chosen to walk that road together, united not by the promise of victory, but by shared commitment to principles that could not be corrupted, bargained away, or traded for expedient advantage. The war would test whether such principles could survive contact with the brutal realities that awaited them. But for the first time since the rebellion began, there existed the possibility that it might end in something other than total victory for one side and total damnation for all. The siege approaches. Terror burned on the horizon as the Death Guard fleet emerged from the warp, their purified vessels bearing scars that told stories of civil war and hard-won redemption. The Throne World's orbital defense platforms turned their massive guns toward the approaching ships with mechanical precision, waiting for orders that would determine whether the 14th Legion came as destroyer or defender. In the silence between heartbeats, as augury arrays analyzed energy signatures and fleet commanders weighed impossible decisions, the fate of humanity's cradle hung balanced on the edge of a blade. Mortarion stood on the bridge of the Endurance, watching as terror grew larger in the main viewer. The world that had given birth to his father's dream appeared smaller than he had expected. A blue-green jewel wrapped in clouds that hid the fortifications Rogel Dawn had spent years constructing. Yet even from this distance, the Primarch could see signs of the preparations underway. Orbital plates bristling with weapon batteries, void shields that shimmed like heat mirages, and the constant traffic of supply ships carrying material to defensive positions that stretched from the outer system to the palace itself. "My lord," reported Captain Garrow from his position at the communications console, his voice carefully neutral despite the tension that filled the bridge. "We're receiving multiple hails from Imperial Navy vessels. Fleet Admiral Sukassan is demanding immediate identification and statement of intent. Her ships are moving to intercept positions." The moment had arrived sooner than Mortarion had hoped. Throughout the journey from the battle site, where his legion had purged itself of corruption, he had dreaded this confrontation more than any enemy he had faced. To stand before his father's loyal sons as a confessed traitor, seeking redemption, was a humiliation that cut deeper than any physical wound. Yet the alternative, allowing terror to fall because pride prevented him from offering aid, was unthinkable. "Open a channel to Admiral Sukassan," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 2 centuries of command, despite the uncertainty that gnawed at his conscience. Priority Alpha clearance, Legion command authentication. The Vox channel opened with a burst of static that spoke of suspicion and military discipline maintained under impossible strain. When Sukassan's voice emerged from the speakers, it carried the weariness of an officer who had been preparing for a siege that might end human civilization. "This is Fleet Admiral Sukassan, commanding Terra Defense Fleet Tertiary. You are ordered to halt your advance and prepare to be boarded for inspection. Any hostile action will result in immediate destruction of your vessels." Mortarion moved closer to the Vox pickup, allowing his words to carry across the void with the weight of absolute sincerity. "Admiral, I am Mortarion of the Death Guard, son of the Emperor, come to offer my sword in defense of Terra. My legion stands ready to serve against the traitors who would destroy our father's dream." The silence that followed stretched across light seconds and through dimensions where time held different meaning. When Sukhasan finally responded, her voice carried disbelief, tinged with desperate hope. "Lord Mortarion, our intelligence reports indicate that the 14th Legion joined Horus in rebellion. Are you claiming to represent loyalist elements within your forces?" The question struck at the heart of what Mortarion had become. Not quite traitor, not quite loyalist, but something new forged in the crucible of choice between damnation and duty. "Admiral, I represent warriors who have chosen a different path than the one Horus offers. We seek neither conquest nor destruction, but the chance to stand against powers that would enslave humanity to alien gods. Grant us audience with Lord Dawn, and we will prove our sincerity through deed rather than word." The communication channel closed as Sukhasan conferred with her superiors, leaving the Death Guard fleet hanging in space, while fate balanced on the decisions of mortals who had never faced choices of such cosmic scope. Around them, the orbital defenses of Terra tracked their movements with patient precision, ready to unleash firepower that could crack continents if the wrong decision was made. It was Rogel Dawn himself who finally answered, his voice emerging from the Vox channels with the unmistakable authority of the Praetorian of Terra. The Imperial Fist's words carried no warmth, but neither did they carry the immediate hostility that Mortarion had expected. "Brother," Dawn said, the word chosen carefully to acknowledge relationship while maintaining distance, "your arrival presents complications that I hadn't planned for. If you speak truly, if your legion has indeed turned from the path of rebellion, then Terra has gained defenders she desperately needs. If you lie, if this is some stratagem of Horus, then you bring destruction to the very gates of our father's palace." Mortarion felt the weight of judgment in his brother's voice, the careful assessment of a fortress builder who trusted walls more than words. "Rogel, I do not ask you to trust me based on blood alone. Bring your most skilled interrogators, your most potent truth-seekers. Test my words against reality itself. All I ask is the chance to prove that redemption is possible, that brothers fallen to darkness can find their way back to the light." The response came not as words, but as action. A single Imperial fist-strike cruiser detached itself from Terra's orbital defenses, approaching the Death Guard fleet under the protection of void shields that could weather planetary bombardment. Aboard that vessel, Mortarion knew, would be Dawn himself, along with whatever companions he deemed necessary for this unprecedented meeting. The encounter took place in the Endurance's primary briefing chamber, where Death Guard captains who had survived the Legion's civil war stood beside their Primarch to face judgment from brothers they had helped betray. The room's atmosphere was thick with tension as two groups of warriors who should have been allies examined each other across a divide carved by months of civil war and conflicting loyalties. Dawn entered first, his massive frame encased in the golden yellow of the 7th Legion, his features set in the immobile lines of a man who trusted duty more than emotion. Behind him came Sanguinius, the Angel, whose perfect features bore the weight of prescient knowledge about the trials ahead. The Great Khan followed, his armor bearing the scars of recent battles fought in the outer system, while at the group's center walked a figure whose presence made the very air shimmer with barely contained power, Malcador the Sigillite appeared as little more than an elderly man in simple robes, but Mortarion's newly awakened psychic senses recoiled from contact with a mind that contained depths no mortal soul should hold. The Regent's eyes, when they fixed upon the Death Guard Primarch, seemed to weigh not just his words, but the very essence of his being. "Mortarion," Sanguinius spoke first, his voice carrying the musical tones that had once inspired loyalty across the galaxy. "I see the change in you, brother. The corruption that marked your aura is gone, burned away by something that blazes brighter than any flame I have witnessed, yet fires that burn so fiercely often consume the very thing they were meant to protect." The angel's words carried warning, along with acknowledgement, recognition that transformation often came at prices too terrible to calculate. Mortarion met his brother's gaze without flinching, allowing Sanguinius to see the scars that purification had carved into his soul. "The price has been steep," Mortarion admitted, his voice carrying the exhaustion of one who had fought battles on fronts that existed beyond the physical realm. "Each use of this gift diminishes something within me, burns away portions of what I once was. But if the cost of purity is the gradual consumption of self, I accept that burden. Better to die pure than live corrupted." Jagatai Khan stepped forward, his movements carrying the fluid grace that had made the White Scars masters of rapid warfare. The Khan's eyes held questions that cut to the heart of what Mortarion had become, doubts about the sustainability of power drawn from such sacrifice. "You speak of purity as though it were a weapon, brother," the Khan said, his words carrying the blunt honesty that characterized all his communications. "Yet weapons wear down with use, break under strain that exceeds their tolerances. What happens when your purifying flame finally consumes the last of your humanity? What manner of creature will you become when nothing remains but the fire itself?" The question struck at fears that Mortarion had carried since first awakening his psychic abilities. Each time he channeled the purifying flames, he felt something essential drain away, leaving behind spaces that might never be filled again. Yet the alternative, allowing corruption to spread unchecked while he preserved his own integrity, was a form of selfishness he could no longer accept. "I do not know what I will become," he answered with brutal honesty. "Perhaps I will burn away entirely, leaving nothing but the memory of good intentions. Perhaps something new will emerge from the ashes of what I was. But I know what I am now, a weapon forged to fight powers that regard honor as weakness and compassion as folly. If that weapon breaks in the using, so be it. At least it will break in service to something greater than itself." Malcador had remained silent throughout these exchanges, his attention focused on perceptions that operated beyond the five senses. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of judgment pronounced by one who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. "Your transformation is genuine," the Regent said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet somehow audible to every person in the chamber. "The taint that once marked your legion has been burned away, replaced by something that operates according to different principles entirely. Yet change alone does not guarantee loyalty. Power, even power drawn from noble sources, has its own corrupting influence. How do we know that your purification will not become its own form of tyranny?" The challenge in Malcador's words was clear. He was not questioning Mortarion's current intentions, but the long-term consequences of the path he had chosen. Power that promised to cleanse corruption could itself become a source of oppression if wielded by one who believed his own purity made him infallible. Mortarion considered the question with the same careful attention he had once given to tactical assessments before crucial battles. The regent's concern was valid. Throughout history, those who claimed divine mandate had often committed atrocities in service to their own righteousness. Yet the alternative was to abandon the one weapon that had proven capable of fighting chaos corruption directly. "You ask for guarantees I cannot provide," Mortarion said at length. "I can offer only my word that this power will be used in defense of those who cannot defend themselves, that it will serve the greater good rather than my own aggrandizement. If that proves insufficient, if I become the very evil I seek to fight, then I trust you and my brothers to stop me by whatever means necessary." The admission hung in the air like incense from a funeral pyre. In acknowledging the possibility of his own corruption, Mortarion had demonstrated a self-awareness that few beings with comparable power possessed. Yet it was Rogel Dawn who finally rendered judgment, his words carrying the finality of strategic assessment made without regard for personal feeling. "Terra's defenses are strong, but not unbreachable," Dawn said, his tone suggesting that sentiment had no place in calculations of such magnitude. "When Horus arrives, he will bring forces that include demon princes and creatures spawned in the warp's deepest reaches. Our conventional weapons, potent though they are, may prove inadequate against enemies that exist partially outside reality itself. If your legion has indeed found ways to fight such corruption directly, then Terra needs what you offer." The Imperial fist moved to one of the chamber's tactical displays, calling up holographic projections that showed the palace's defensive architecture in exhaustive detail. "The Saturnine Gate has always been our weakest point, too large to seal completely, too important to abandon entirely. Intelligence suggests that Horus will concentrate his demon-spawned forces there, believing that conventional corruption will overwhelm our defenses. If your purified Death Guard can hold that position, if your flames can burn away whatever horrors emerge from the warp, then we may have a chance to weather the initial assault." The assignment was both honor and test, placing the Death Guard at the point where the siege's outcome would likely be determined. If Mortarion's claims proved true, his legion would become the cornerstone of Terra's defense. If he still served Horus in secret, his betrayal would come at the moment when it could cause maximum damage. "We accept," Mortarion said without hesitation. "The 14th Legion will hold the Saturnine Gate against whatever emerges from the warp. We will prove through deed that redemption is more than empty words, that brothers fallen to darkness can still serve the light." The meeting dissolved into planning sessions that stretched through Terra's shortened day, as commanders who had expected to face each other as enemies worked together to prepare defenses against the storm that was coming. Yet even as strategic assessments were made and tactical deployments finalized, each participant carried away their own understanding of what Mortarion's arrival meant for the siege ahead. Dawn saw a weapon that might prove decisive against enemies conventional tactics could not touch. Sanguinius sensed tragedy and heroism intertwined in ways that would echo through eternity. The Khan recognized the courage required to choose personal destruction over easy power. Malcador perceived the birth of something unprecedented, a force that might reshape the very nature of humanity's relationship with the warp itself, as Terra's sun set behind atmospheric processors that labored to maintain breathable air, despite the system-wide preparations for war. Mortarion stood on the Endurance's observation deck and contemplated the road that had brought him to this moment. Behind him lay a trail of choices that had cost him everything he had once valued: his independence, his certainty, his very humanity. Ahead waited trials that would test whether the price he had paid would prove worthwhile. The siege was coming. The galaxy would burn. And in the crucible of that final battle, the universe would learn whether purity could triumph over corruption, whether duty could overcome damnation, whether love could prove stronger than the hunger of gods who fed on mortal suffering. Time would tell whether the Death Guard's redemption was genuine or merely another form of damnation wearing a more appealing face. But for now, they had chosen their side and accepted their role. When the darkness came to claim Terra, they would stand against it with flames that burned away everything except the truth. The Pale King's Legion, in the armories beneath Terra's surface, where the Death Guard had been granted space to prepare for the siege ahead, the sound of hammers rang against adamantium with rhythmic precision. Each blow carried purpose beyond mere maintenance, as warriors who had once embraced corruption now labored to purge every trace of their former allegiance from armor and weapon alike. The work was meticulous, almost ritualistic, performed by hands that understood the difference between cleansing and destruction. Mortarion moved through the workshops with the measured pace of a craftsman, inspecting work that would determine whether his sons lived or died in the trials ahead. The familiar weight of silence hung across his shoulders, but even his ancient scythe had been subjected to the same purification rituals that transformed everything the Death Guard touched. Where once its blade had been stained with the residue of toxic worlds, now it gleamed with inner light that spoke of purposes both terrible and pure. Captain Garrow approached his Primarch with a helm in his hands, its surface bearing new heraldry that told the story of their transformation. The traditional Death Guard skull had been retained, but now flames wreathed the bone-white symbol, tongues of fire that seemed to dance even in the workshop's steady illumination. Below the skull, crossed scythes replaced the old insignia, their blades etched with high Gothic prayers that called upon powers older than the warp's chaotic currents. "The artificers have completed the first production run," Garrow reported, his voice carrying satisfaction tempered by the understanding that symbols alone would not win the coming battle. "Each piece has been blessed according to the rituals you provided, cleansed of any taint that might provide purchase for corruption. The men are eager to don armor that reflects what we have become rather than what we once were." Mortarion accepted the helm for examination, his enhanced senses detecting no trace of the spiritual contamination that had once marked Death Guard equipment. The purification process had required him to touch each piece personally, channeling cleansing flames through metal and ceramite until every molecule resonated with energies that actively repelled warp-spawned influence. The work was exhausting, draining reserves he could ill afford to expend before battle was joined. Yet it was necessary. His sons would face enemies that could corrupt through contact alone. Their protection must be absolute. "Tell me about the new recruits," he said, setting the helm aside to examine a bolter whose barrel had been inscribed with ward symbols that would prevent demon possession of its machine spirit. "How do they adapt to techniques that run counter to everything they learned as neophytes?" Garrow's expression grew thoughtful as he considered warriors who represented something unprecedented in the Legions Astartes' long history. The Death Guard had always recruited from toxic worlds where survival required adaptation to poisonous environments. Their gene seed modifications enhanced that natural resistance, creating warriors who could fight in conditions that would kill other space marines within minutes. Now, those same warriors were learning to turn their resistance inward, building mental and spiritual barriers against corruption that operated according to entirely different principles. "They struggle at first," Garrow admitted, with characteristic honesty. "Everything in their conditioning tells them to absorb and endure whatever they encounter, teaching them to reject influence, to push back against powers that seek to change them from within. It requires unlearning reflexes that have kept them alive for decades. The captain moved to a training area where Death Guard veterans worked with newer recruits, demonstrating techniques that bore no resemblance to conventional combat doctrine. Instead of weapon drills, the warriors practiced meditation forms that Mortarion had developed during his own transformation. Each exercise was designed to strengthen mental discipline while maintaining the physical conditioning that made Space Marines supremely effective in battle. "Watch Sergeant Harker work with the new men," Garrow continued, indicating a grizzled veteran whose armor bore scars from the fleet's civil war. "He lost half his squad during the purges, yet he shows no bitterness when training their replacements. If anything, he has become more committed to ensuring they understand what we fight for now." Mortarion observed the training session with growing approval. Harcourt moved among the recruits with patient authority, correcting stances that would allow psychic intrusion, demonstrating breathing patterns that maintained clarity under supernatural assault. The techniques drew from sources that predated the Imperium itself, warrior-monk traditions that had understood the connection between physical and spiritual discipline long before humanity reached the stars. "The old ways taught us to endure," Harcourt was saying to a young Marine whose concentration wavered during a particularly demanding exercise. "That was sufficient when our enemies wielded conventional weapons, fought battles that obeyed natural law. But corruption works differently. It does not seek to destroy you outright, but to make you complicit in your own transformation. Endurance becomes cooperation. Survival becomes surrender." The sergeant's words carried weight beyond their tactical implications. He was describing a fundamental shift in how the Death Guard understood their purpose, moving from passive resistance to active opposition against forces that threatened not just their bodies, but their very souls. "Tell me about the Pale Wardens," Mortarion said, as they continued their inspection of the training facilities. The elite formation represented the ultimate expression of his legion's new doctrine, warriors specifically trained to face the most dangerous servants of chaos without falling prey to their corrupting influence. Garrow's expression brightened with genuine pride. 32 warriors drawn from every company, each one a volunteer who survived direct contact with demon entities during the fleet actions. They have proven their resistance to corruption through trial rather than theory. Captain Erlen leads them now, having developed techniques that allow coordinated assault against targets that exist partially outside reality. The Pale Wardens trained in a separate chamber, their exercises conducted under conditions that would have been considered impossible before Mortarion's transformation. Psychic flames danced around the warriors as they practiced boarding actions against mock-ups of demon engines, learning to coordinate their movements while channeling purifying energies that burned away supernatural defenses. Each warrior bore equipment that had been personally blessed by their Primarch, weapons and armor that gleamed with inner fire when wielded against corruption. "They will be our spear point when the siege begins," Mortarion mused, watching as the Wardens executed maneuvers that combined conventional tactics with metaphysical warfare. "When Horus unleashes horrors that Ahovat bolter fire and blade work, they will be the ones who reach the enemy's heart and tear it out by the roots." The culmination of their preparation came at Terra's midnight, when Mortarion gathered his entire legion in the great assembly hall that Dawn had provided for their use. 5,000 warriors stood in perfect formation, their new heraldry gleaming under illumination panels that cast no shadows. Each wore armor that had been purified at the molecular level, carried weapons that hummed with protective energies, bore the marks of a transformation that went deeper than mere equipment. Mortarion stood before them on a raised dais, his presence radiating the controlled power that had become his defining characteristic. When he spoke, his words carried to every corner of the vast chamber, amplified not by mechanical means, but by the psychic resonance that bound him to his sons. "Warriors of the 14th Legion," he began, his voice carrying the weight of conviction earned through suffering and sacrifice. "You stand tonight as something that has never existed before in the galaxy's long history. Not as warriors who endure corruption, but as those who actively fight against it. Not as survivors who adapt to poisonous environments, but as purifiers who cleanse the very concept of spiritual toxin from reality itself." He paused, allowing his words to settle into minds that had been shaped by experiences most mortals could not survive. Around him, the silence carried anticipation mixed with understanding. These were warriors who had chosen the harder path, who had embraced transformation that promised struggle rather than easy victory. "The enemy that comes to Terra brings more than armies," Mortarion continued, his words taking on the cadence of ritual as he spoke truths that needed to be acknowledged. "They bring despair wearing the mask of hope, corruption disguised as evolution, slavery presented as freedom. Against such enemies, conventional weapons are insufficient. Courage alone will not prevail. Only purity of purpose, clarity of vision, and willingness to pay any price in defense of what we hold sacred can stand against the darkness that seeks to claim everything we love." The Primarch's gaze swept across the assembled ranks, taking in faces that bore the marks of recent trials. Some showed fresh scars from the civil war that had torn the Legion apart. Others carried the subtle changes that came from exposure to purifying flames that burned away corruption along with portions of their original selves. All reflected a determination that transcended mere military discipline. "You have volunteered for duties that may cost you everything," he said, his voice softening without losing its authority. "The power that flows through our armor and weapons is not without price. Each battle we fight against corruption will demand sacrifice from us, will strip away pieces of what we once were in service to what we must become. I cannot promise you victory without cost, survival without loss, or triumph that does not exact its own terrible price." The admission hung in the air like incense from a funeral pyre. In acknowledging the costs of their chosen path, Mortarion had demonstrated the honesty that distinguished true leadership from mere authority. Yet his next words carried promise along with warning. "But I can promise you this, that your sacrifices will serve a purpose greater than individual survival, that your suffering will purchase something worth more than personal comfort. When this war ends, when the last daemon has been banished and the final corruption purged, humanity will remember that when darkness threatened to claim everything, there were warriors who chose duty over power, service over self-preservation, purity over corruption." The ceremony that followed transformed ritual into reality as each warrior came forward to receive personal blessing from their Primarch. Mortarion touched each helm, each breastplate, each weapon, with hands that channeled purifying fire into the very atoms of their equipment. The process took hours, exhausting reserves that would require days to fully replenish, yet he continued until every Death Guard bore protection that would serve them in the trials ahead. As Terra's artificial dawn broke over the palace fortifications, the Death Guard emerged from their preparation chambers, bearing new purpose along with new heraldry. They were no longer the toxic-resistant warriors who had once served in Horus's rebellion, nor were they simply loyalists who had changed sides for expedient reasons. They had become something unprecedented, a force specifically designed to fight corruption itself, wielded by a Primarch who had transformed personal suffering into a weapon against the very powers that sought to enslave humanity. The siege was coming. The galaxy would burn. But when the darkness pressed against Terra's walls, it would face opposition that had been forged in crucibles of choice and tempered by sacrifices that most mortals could not comprehend. The Death Guard had chosen their path, not in ignorance of its costs, but with full understanding that the road ahead would demand everything they were and everything they might become. In their workshops beneath the palace, the sound of hammers continued to ring against metal as the final preparations were completed. Each blow carried the weight of purpose, each strike a declaration that some things were worth dying for, some principles worth any sacrifice to defend. The pale flames of their heraldry danced in the reflected light of weapons that would soon taste demon blood, armor that would soon deflect the claws of creatures spawned in humanity's darkest nightmares. They were ready. The question that remained was whether the universe was prepared for what they had become, whether even the gods of chaos could stand against warriors who had chosen purity over power and found strength in that choice that transcended anything that the warp had to offer. Time would provide the answer. But for now, it was enough that they stood ready, united in purpose, armed with weapons that burned with inner fire and protected by armor that gleamed with the light of absolute conviction. The Death Guard had been reborn. The galaxy would learn what that meant when the siege began. The traitor's gambit. The diplomatic shuttle arrived under flags of parley, its hull bearing the black of the 16th Legion, untainted by the corruption that had claimed so many of Horus's vessels. The craft moved through Terra's orbital defenses with careful precision, broadcasting clearances that identified it as bearing envoys under ancient protocols that predated the imperium itself. Even in civil war, some traditions remained sacred, their violation marking the difference between conflict and chaos. Mortarion watched the shuttle's approach from the observation deck of his command center, his enhanced vision tracking the sleek lines of a vessel designed for speed rather than combat. The diplomatic immunity it claimed was genuine, verified through channels that both sides still honored, despite the gulf of ideology and ambition that separated them. Yet the Death Guard Primarch felt unease settle into his bones as he contemplated what message Horus might send at this moment, what words might carry sufficient weight to justify personal envoy rather than standard Vox transmission. "My lord," Captain Garrow reported from his position at the communication console, his voice carefully neutral despite the tension that radiated from every Death Guard present. "The shuttle requests permission to dock at Bay 7. They claim diplomatic status under the Nicaea Accords, with passenger manifest listing a single envoy bearing sealed communications from the War Master himself." The mention of Nicaea sent ripples of memory through Mortarion's consciousness, recollections of a time when the Primarchs had gathered as brothers to debate the future of Psyker rights within the Legiones Astartes. The accords reached during that council had established protocols for communication even between hostile forces, recognizing that some conversations required the sanctity of ancient tradition to carry proper weight. If Horus was invoking those protocols, his message carried significance beyond mere tactical coordination. "Grant permission to dock," Mortarion commanded, his decision carrying the weight of curiosity tempered by caution. "Full security escort to the briefing chamber. Standard diplomatic protocols but maximum alert status for all personnel." The preparations that followed adhered to traditions that stretched back through millennia of human conflict, rituals that acknowledged the difference between warrior and emissary, combatant and communicator. The briefing chamber was cleared of all sensitive materials, while guards took positions that honored the envoy's immunity, while ensuring the safety of Terra's defenders. When the shuttle's occupant finally emerged, Mortarion felt recognition strike him like a physical blow. Little Horus Aximand walked through the docking bay with the measured stride of a warrior who had served alongside legends for decades. The captain of the 16th Legion's 5th Company bore the scars of recent battles, his armor showing patches where ceramite had been replaced and servo joints adjusted to accommodate wounds that had not fully healed. Yet his bearing remained proud, his movements carrying the unconscious authority of one who had stood at the War Master's side through triumphs that had reshaped the galaxy. The sight of Aximand stirred emotions that Mortarion had thought buried beneath months of transformation and purification. This was not some anonymous emissary, but a warrior he had fought beside during the Great Crusade's golden years. A man whose courage and loyalty had earned respect from every primarch who had witnessed his deeds. To see him now, bearing messages from a brother who had fallen to corruption, carried tragedy that cut deeper than any weapon. The meeting took place in the chamber where Mortarion had addressed his legion only days before, though now the vast space felt intimate with only 2 figures standing beneath illumination panels that cast no shadows. Aximand carried himself with the dignity befitting his diplomatic status, yet his eyes showed the weariness of a man who had witnessed the dissolution of everything he had once held sacred. "Lord Mortarion," Aximand began, his voice carrying the formal cadences required by protocol, while underlying tones suggested personal pain that ran deeper than mere professional duty. "I come bearing words from Horus Lupercal, War Master of the Imperium, to his beloved brother, who has walked a path that brings both sorrow and hope to those who remember better days." The formal greeting carried undertones that spoke of relationships forged in battle and tempered by shared sacrifice. Mortarion gestured for his guest to continue, settling his own emotions behind the disciplined facade he had maintained through decades of commanding warriors who looked to him for certainty in an uncertain universe. "Speak, then," Mortarion replied, his words chosen to acknowledge both Aximand's status and the gravity of whatever message he carried. Let the War Master's words be heard and weighed according to their merit rather than their source. Aximand nodded with appreciation for courtesies maintained despite the circumstances that had brought them to this point. When he spoke again, his voice carried the measured tones of one delivering a message whose every word had been carefully considered for maximum effect. "The War Master acknowledges your recent transformation with interest rather than anger," Aximand said, his pause before the word transformation suggesting careful selection of terminology that avoided more inflammatory descriptions. He recognizes that the path of rebellion contains many branches, not all of which lead to the same destination. Your resistance to certain influences demonstrates wisdom rather than weakness, strength rather than stubborn pride. The words carried implications that set Mortarion's teeth on edge, even as they stirred memories of brotherhood that predated the current conflict. Horus was offering understanding rather than condemnation, acceptance rather than punishment for choices that had cost both brothers dearly. Yet beneath the diplomatic language lay assumptions about corruption and influence that revealed how little the War Master truly understood about what had driven the Death Guard's transformation. "The War Master further wishes me to convey his admiration for your Legion's ability to purge itself of unwanted elements," Aximand continued, his voice gaining strength as he moved to the heart of his message. "Such tactical flexibility, such refusal to accept external dictates about your warrior's destiny, demonstrates the independence that made you effective during the Great Crusade. Horus sees in your actions not betrayal but evolution, not weakness but a different form of strength." Mortarion felt a chill that had nothing to do with Terra's recycled atmosphere. The message's subtext suggested that Horus viewed the Death Guard's civil war as merely another tactical decision, their rejection of chaos corruption as simple preference rather than moral awakening. The War Master saw independence where Mortarion had found purpose, calculated rebellion where the Death Lord had discovered redemption. "And what does the War Master propose in light of this evolution?" Mortarion asked, his tone carefully neutral, despite growing certainty that whatever offer came would reveal depths of manipulation he had never suspected in his former brother. Aximand's expression shifted subtly, moving from formal delivery to something approaching personal appeal. "Horus offers you what you have always deserved. True autonomy for your legion, freedom from the suffocating oversight that characterized our father's reign, acknowledgement of your right to determine your own destiny without interference from powers that view primarchs as tools rather than sons." The offer hung in the air between them, like smoke from distant fires. On its surface, it promised everything that Mortarion had once believed he wanted: independence from imperial bureaucracy, freedom from his father's distant supervision, autonomy to govern his legion according to his own principles. Yet the Death Guard Primarch had learned to listen for what was not said as carefully as what was spoken aloud. "Continue," he said simply, waiting for revelations he suspected would transform apparent generosity into something far more complex. Aximand stepped closer, his voice dropping to tones that carried personal conviction alongside diplomatic necessity. "There were always plans within plans, my lord. The War Master understood from the beginning that not every Primarch would embrace the same path to freedom from our father's tyranny. Some would find strength in the ancient powers that preceded humanity's rise. Others would forge different alliances, discover different sources of power to fuel their independence." The admission struck Mortarion like a physical blow. Aximand was revealing that Horus had anticipated resistance to chaos corruption from some of his brothers, had planned for alternatives that would still serve his ultimate purpose of overthrowing the Emperor. The Death Guard's apparent rebellion against their rebellion had been foreseen, perhaps even encouraged, as part of a larger strategy that Mortarion was only beginning to comprehend. The War Master viewed corruption as a means rather than an end, Aximand continued, his words carrying the weight of secrets shared among the inner circle. "A tool for breaking the bonds that tied us to a father who viewed his sons as extensions of his own will, rather than individuals deserving of respect and autonomy. That some Primarchs would find different tools to achieve the same liberation was not only anticipated, but welcomed. Diversity of approach strengthens the overall rebellion rather than weakening it." Mortarion's hands clenched involuntarily as the full scope of Horus's manipulation became clear. The War Master had not simply fallen to chaos influence, but had embraced it as one option among many for achieving his goals. The Death Guard's purification was seen not as moral awakening, but as tactical innovation that could serve the same ends through different means. Every choice Mortarion had made in pursuit of redemption was being reframed as another form of rebellion against the Emperor's authority. "And what role does the War Master envision for warriors who have chosen different tools?" Mortarion asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Aximand's smile carried genuine warmth alongside calculation that spoke of intelligence shaped by years at Horus's side. "You would serve as you always have, as the War Master's most trusted brother, commander of forces uniquely suited to face enemies that other weapons cannot touch. Your purified Death Guard would become the hammer that strikes where corruption cannot reach." the blade that cuts through defenses built around assumption and prejudice, rather than tactical reality. The vision Aximand painted was seductive in its apparent logic. Mortarion's legion would retain their newfound purpose, while serving broader strategic goals that transcended mere destruction of the imperium. They would become specialists in fighting corruption itself, weapons wielded by a war master, wise enough to understand that victory required diverse tools applied with precision rather than brute force alone. Yet beneath the surface, appeal lay assumptions that transformed purification into another form of warfare, redemption into tactical advantage, moral awakening into strategic asset. Horus saw the Death Guard's transformation through lenses that reduced everything to questions of power and control, unable to comprehend that some changes ran deeper than mere tactical innovation. "The offer is generous," Mortarion said at length, his words chosen to acknowledge the apparent value of what was being proposed while leaving space for deeper considerations. "Yet I find myself wondering whether the War Master truly understands what my legion has become, what price we have paid for the purity we now possess." Aximand's expression shifted slightly, suggesting recognition that his message was not achieving its intended effect. "Enlighten me, my lord. What have you paid that the War Master has not also sacrificed in pursuit of freedom from our father's tyranny?" The question revealed the fundamental gap between their perspectives. Aximand and his master viewed the war in terms of political freedom, tactical advantage, and strategic positioning against an emperor they saw as tyrannical. They could not comprehend transformation that operated according to entirely different principles, change that served purposes beyond mere rebellion or conquest. "We have paid with certainty," Mortarion replied, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won understanding. "With the comfort of simple answers, with the luxury of believing that power alone determines righteousness. My sons have learned that purity requires constant choice, constant sacrifice, constant commitment to principles that offer no guarantee of victory or survival." The Death Guard Primarch moved to the chamber's great viewport, gazing out at Terra's scarred surface, where billions of souls prepared for a siege that would determine humanity's future. What the War Master offers is another form of service, another master to follow in exchange for promises of autonomy that ring hollow to ears that have heard such pledges before. You speak of freedom while describing chains, offer independence while outlining duties that bind us to purposes we didn't choose. Aximand's diplomatic composure began to crack, revealing frustration born from watching a carefully crafted appeal fall upon unreceptive ground. "My lord, you speak as though moral awakening and tactical advantage cannot coexist, as if purity must come at the cost of practical effectiveness. The War Master does not seek to compromise your principles, but to provide context where those principles can serve purposes greater than individual satisfaction." The captain's words carried echoes of arguments Mortarion had heard before, appeals that reduced everything to questions of utility and effectiveness. Yet the Death Guard Primarch had learned to recognize the difference between service that preserved identity and submission that eroded it through slow compromise. "Tell your master this," Mortarion said, turning from the viewport to face his guest with eyes that blazed with inner fire. "The 14th Legion serves principles that transcend political loyalty or tactical advantage. We fight against corruption, not because it opposes our allies, but because it threatens everything worth preserving in this universe. Our purity is not a weapon to be wielded by others, but a choice we make anew with each breath, each heartbeat, each moment when temptation whispers that easier paths exist." The rejection carried finality that made further appeal pointless. Yet Aximand made one last attempt to bridge the gulf that had opened between former allies. The War Master remembers when we fought beside each other, brother beside brother, united in purpose that seemed unshakable. Those bonds still exist, scarred but not broken. Is there nothing of that fellowship worth preserving? Mortarion felt the weight of memory press against his resolve. Recollections of campaigns where trust had flowed as freely as blood, where victory had been shared among warriors who believed their cause transcended individual ambition. The bonds Aximand spoke of had been real, forged in crucibles that tested character as much as courage. The fellowship was real, he admitted, his voice carrying sorrow for what had been lost alongside determination about what must be preserved. But it was built upon foundations that proved less solid than we believed. When brothers choose different paths, when principles diverge beyond reconciliation, even the strongest bonds cannot bridge the gaps that open between them. The meeting ended with courtesies that honored diplomatic tradition while acknowledging the failure of appeals that had carried real hope alongside calculated manipulation. Aximand departed, bearing messages that would reach Horus within hours, words that would inform the War Master that his most trusted brother had chosen a path that led away from everything their rebellion represented. As the diplomatic shuttle disappeared into the void beyond Terra's orbital defenses, Mortarion stood alone in the briefing chamber and contemplated the road that had brought him to this moment of final separation. Behind him lay a trail of choices that had cost him certainty, comfort, and the easy camaraderie of warriors united by shared rebellion. Ahead waited trials that would test whether the principles he had embraced could withstand the fury of a brother who had been denied what he most desired to reclaim. The die was cast. The galaxy would burn, and in the crucible of that fire, the universe would learn whether purity of purpose could triumph over the seductive promises of power unbound by moral constraint. Horus had made his offer and been refused. Now would come the test of whether that refusal could be maintained when friendship gave way to fury, when diplomatic appeal transformed into personal vendetta, when the War Master's manipulation was replaced by the terrible simplicity of force applied without restraint or mercy. The siege was coming, and with it would come a reckoning that would reshape the very nature of what it meant to be loyal in an age when loyalty itself had become a question rather than an answer. When Daemon's walk, the first sign of the siege's beginning, was not the thunder of orbital bombardment or the shriek of drop pods cutting through Terra's poisoned atmosphere, but silence, the sudden cessation of Vox traffic that had maintained constant chatter between defense positions for weeks. In that moment of unnatural quiet, as communication arrays died and augury stations went dark, every defender of the Imperial Palace understood that the time for preparation had ended and the hour of testing had arrived. Mortarion stood atop the Saturnine Gate's main rampart, watching as shapes that defied conventional description descended from the roiling clouds that had replaced Terra's sky. The enemy came not in orderly formations, but as a tide of corruption given form. Creatures spawned in the warp's deepest reaches, mixed with warriors who had once served the Emperor's dream. Among them, commanding from the center of the advancing horde, flew a figure that made the Primarch's enhanced vision recoil from contact with its twisted magnificence. Typhus had returned, but the demon prince who bore that name resembled the fallen first captain only in the hatred that blazed from eyes that had witnessed the birth and death of solar systems. His form had swollen beyond any pretense of humanity, great appendages trailing diseased vapors that killed plant life across entire city blocks with their passage. The Terminus Est followed in his wake, no longer a recognizable vessel, but a living hive ship whose hull pulsed with organic rhythms that spoke of purposes that served no mortal will. "Contact with Bastion 7 lost," reported Captain Garrow from his position at the tactical display, his voice maintaining professional calm despite readings that showed impossible energy signatures advancing across Terra's surface. Eastern approaches show massive biosignatures, unknown classification. Whatever comes against us operates according to principles our sensors cannot properly analyze. The Death Guard positions along the Saturnine Gate had been prepared according to doctrines that seemed prophetic in hindsight. Where once the 14th Legion had specialized in toxic warfare, their equipment designed to function in environments that would kill other space marines within minutes, now those same protective systems served entirely different purposes. Rebreather units that had once filtered poisonous atmospheres now cleansed air corrupted by demon breath. Sealed armor that had resisted chemical weapons now provided barriers against corruption that operated on spiritual rather than molecular levels. The first wave struck the outer defenses with force that shattered rockcrete barriers designed to withstand planetary bombardment. Yet these were not conventional weapons that dealt damage through kinetic energy or explosive force. The attackers brought corruption itself as their primary armament, seeking to transform Terra's defenders into willing servants, rather than simply destroying them. Where their claws found purchase, loyal space marines began to change, their gene-forged constitutions proving inadequate against influences that attacked the very concept of genetic purity. It was then that Mortarion's transformation proved its worth beyond all expectation. The purifying flames that danced around his form spread through the Death Guard battle line like wildfire, creating zones of absolute protection where corruption could find no purchase. Imperial Army regiments that had expected to die horribly in the first minutes of contact instead found themselves shielded by warriors whose very presence burned away influences that sought to claim their souls. "Advance by sections," Mortarion commanded, through vox channels that crackled with interference spawned by psychic turbulence. "Form cleansing wedges around each heavy weapon position. Do not attempt to hold static positions against enemies that can corrupt defensive works simply by touching them. Movement, purification, constant advance against targets that cannot be allowed to establish footholds on Terra's soil." The tactics that followed represented the complete inversion of everything the Death Guard had once represented. Instead of laying down toxic barrages that made terrain uninhabitable for enemies, they advanced through clouds of spiritual poison that would have killed any other force instantly. Their weapons, blessed with purifying energies that burned away corruption at the molecular level, carved through diamond flesh that laughed at conventional ammunition. Most importantly, they served not as harbingers of environmental destruction, but as liberators who cleansed infection from the very ground they walked upon. The first direct confrontation with corrupted Death Guard came at the third defensive line, where a full company of plague marines, led by a captain, whose name Mortarion remembered from recruitment ceremonies, decades past launched an assault that should have been impossible to survive. These were warriors who had once served under his direct command, their tactical knowledge identical to that of the defenders they faced, their equipment modified by the same corrupting influences that had claimed Typhus himself. Captain Nathaniel Garrow led the countercharge with precision that spoke of battles fought across 100 worlds, his power sword wreathed in flames that left after-images on mortal retinas. Behind him came the Pale Wardens, their specialized training allowing them to coordinate attacks against enemies that existed partially outside reality. The sight of Death Guard fighting Death Guard, purification, battling corruption, with weapons drawn from the same source, created tableau of struggle that would have broken lesser minds simply to witness. "Remember who they were," Mortarion called to his warriors as battle was joined in earnest. "Remember the oaths they swore, the dreams they shared, the brotherhood that corruption has stolen from them. Give them the mercy they cannot ask for, the peace they can no longer comprehend. Make their deaths mean something more than simple victory." The words carried across the battlefield through psychic resonance rather than mere sound, reaching Death Guard, who found themselves facing brothers whose faces they recognized beneath corrupted helms. The fighting that followed was vicious beyond description, not because the participants lacked skill or courage, but because each blow struck at hearts that remembered better days. These were not anonymous enemies, but corrupted reflections of what the defenders might have become, twisted mirrors that showed the price of different choices made in moments of desperate need. Yet the purified Death Guard proved superior to their corrupted counterparts in ways that transcended mere tactical advantage. Where the Plague Marines fought with the mechanical efficiency of the damned, driven by hunger they could never satisfy, Mortarion's warriors battled with purpose that transformed individual combat into collective symphony. Their coordination spoke of discipline maintained through choice rather than compulsion, unity forged in understanding rather than imposed through supernatural influence. The turning point came when Typhus himself descended to the battlefield, his massive form crushing defensive barriers through simple mass, while lesser demons cavorted in his wake, like children following a beloved uncle. The Herald of Nurgle had grown beyond the limitations that confined even demon princes to single locations, his presence warping reality around him until the very air became thick with spores that carried diseases with names that predated human language. "My beloved father," Typhus called, his voice carrying across kilometers of battlefield with harmonics that made stone weep, pus, and metal corrode at accelerated rates. "How good of you to join us for the final celebration. Your stubborn resistance has only made this moment sweeter, your defiance more amusing when it finally breaks against inevitable truth." Mortarion stepped forward to meet his fallen son, silence gleaming with purifying radiance that carved channels of clean air through the miasma of corruption that surrounded the Daman Prince. The sight of the two figures approaching each other, across ground that alternately burned with cleansing fire and bubbled with diseased growth, created a moment of perfect clarity in the chaos of battle. Here was the fundamental conflict made manifest: purity against corruption, choice against compulsion, love against the hunger that devoured everything it touched. "You were never my son," Mortarion replied, his words carrying the weight of judgment pronounced by one who had learned the difference between affection and true love. "Callus Typhon was my son, a warrior who served with honor, until ambition made him vulnerable to powers that promised everything while delivering only slavery. You are merely a parasite wearing his face, using his memories to inflict pain on those who remember him with fondness." The battle between them defied conventional description, operating simultaneously on physical and metaphysical levels as two opposed philosophies tested their strength against each other. Typhus fought with power, drawn from sources that had existed since the universe's birth, his attacks carrying diseases that could corrupt space marines through armor contact alone. Mortarion countered with flames that burned away the very concept of corruption, each parry creating zones where natural law reasserted itself against supernatural influence. Around them, the siege continued with intensity that defied mortal endurance. Imperial army regiments that should have broken within minutes of first contact instead held their positions, protected by Death Guard, whose presence cleansed the air they breathed and the ground they stood upon. Artillery batteries that should have fallen to demon possession continued firing, their machine spirits purified by proximity to warriors who carried protection that extended beyond their own forms. The sight of Mortarion's forces advancing through corruption that would have claimed any other defenders sent ripples of shock through the attacking horde. These were enemies that Nurgle's servants had expected to convert rather than defeat, loyal forces whose transformation would provide both tactical advantage and spiritual satisfaction. Instead, they found themselves facing warriors who turned their primary weapons against them, who thrived in environments designed to break the will of those who opposed the plague god's gifts. "This is impossible," Typhus snarled, as silence carved through defenses that had withstood the attention of demon princes for millennia. "Purity is weakness, resistance is futile. All things must decay and be reborn in Grandfather's garden. You fight against the fundamental laws that govern existence itself." Mortarion's response came not in words, but in action, his scythe carving away layers of corruption that had accumulated around his fallen son's essence. With each strike, more of what Typhus had become burned away, revealing glimpses of the warrior who had once served with distinction before ambition opened doorways that should have remained sealed. "The only law that governs existence is choice," the Primarch said, as his blade found purchase in spiritual flesh that shrieked with voices that had never drawn breath. "You chose slavery disguised as power, corruption presented as evolution, damnation wearing the mask of transcendence. My sons have chosen differently, and that choice has made them stronger than anything your patron can offer." The Death Guard advance continued across battlefields that resembled nothing in their previous experience. Instead of leaving toxic wastelands in their wake, they restored corrupted ground to natural state through simple passage. Instead of spreading death through environmental manipulation, they brought life back to areas that had been claimed by influences hostile to organic existence. Most remarkably, they did this not through supernatural intervention, but through disciplined application of principles that any warrior could learn, given sufficient commitment and proper teaching. Imperial army commanders who had expected to sacrifice their regiments as speed bumps against unstoppable corruption instead found themselves coordinating with allies whose presence transformed hopeless last stands into winnable engagements. Mortarion Iron Guard, who should have been overwhelmed by plague zombies, instead advanced through purified corridors carved by Death Guard flamers. Cadian shock troops who had prepared for death with honor discovered that survival with purpose remained possible even in battles against literal demons. The psychological effect on both sides was profound. Nurgle's servants, accustomed to enemies who despaired at the sight of their corruption, found themselves facing warriors who seemed to grow stronger as battle progressed. The Death Guard, fighting for the first time as purifiers rather than destroyers, discovered reserves of strength they had never known they possessed. Most importantly, the ordinary humans caught between these supernatural forces began to understand that even gods could be defied by mortals who chose principle over expedience. As Terra's sun set behind clouds that rained diseased precipitation across the Imperial Palace's outer districts, the first day of siege ended with defensive lines that had not only held but actually advanced against enemies that should have been unstoppable. The Saturnine Gate remained in Imperial hands, protected by warriors who had transformed their greatest weakness into their ultimate strength. Yet Mortarion knew that this was merely the beginning. Typhus had withdrawn, but not been destroyed, his essence reforming in deeper reaches of the warp, where defeat became merely another form of education. The Herald of Nurgle would return with greater power and deeper understanding of his opponent's capabilities. When that happened, the real test of Death Guard purification would begin. Standing atop ramparts that gleamed with residual cleansing fire, watching as his warriors tended to wounds that healed faster in air, purified by their own presence, Mortarion allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, tempered by grim understanding. They had proven their worth in battle, demonstrated that corruption could be fought and defeated through disciplined application of principles that transcended individual capability. But the siege had only begun, and the enemy learned quickly from defeat. Tomorrow would bring fresh horrors, new tests of resolve that would determine whether purity could be maintained under pressure that would break mountains. The galaxy watched, unaware that one Primarch's choice to reject easy power had introduced variables into calculations that had proceeded along predictable lines for millennia. The Death Guard had chosen their path and proven worthy of it. Time would tell whether that worthiness could be maintained when the real war began. The price of purity. In the Medici chambers beneath the Saturnine Gate, where the wounded from Terra's defense were brought for treatment that might preserve their lives, if not their sanity, Chief Apothecary Vadon worked over instruments that registered readings no medical training had prepared him to interpret. The patient before him was a Primarch, one of the Emperor's 20 sons. Yet the vital signs displayed on his monitoring equipment suggested something that defied every principle of Space Marine physiology. Mortarion lay unconscious on a surgical table designed for warriors whose enhanced constitutions could survive wounds that would kill ordinary mortals instantly. His pale skin bore no visible trauma, no bolter impacts or blade wounds that might explain his condition. Yet every scan revealed deterioration that proceeded according to no pattern any apothecary had witnessed in decades of treating the most grievous battle injuries. His cellular structure shows aging equivalent to centuries of natural progression compressed into hours, Vadon reported to Captain Garrow, his voice carrying professional calm that barely concealed underlying confusion. Each time he channels those purifying flames, the process burns away something fundamental about his physical matrix. Not damage that can be repaired, but consumption that appears to be irreversible. Garrow stood beside his Primarch's still form, watching monitors that showed a twin-hearted system under stress that transcended mere physical exertion. The captain's scarred features showed concern that went beyond tactical considerations about their commander's combat effectiveness. This was personal anguish at watching a father figure sacrifice himself piece by piece for the sake of warriors who looked to him for guidance and protection. "Is there anything that can be done?" Garrow asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would bring little comfort. Some treatment that might slow the deterioration, preserve his strength for the battles yet to come? Vadon's hesitation spoke volumes about the futility of conventional medicine when faced with conditions that operated according to metaphysical rather than biological principles. "I can treat symptoms, manage pain levels, provide stimulants that might maintain consciousness during critical moments. But the fundamental problem lies beyond the reach of any medical intervention I understand. His soul is burning away from within, consumed by the very power he uses to protect us." The revelation hung in the sterile air of the Medici chamber, like toxic gas from a battlefield, where too many good warriors had died for causes that offered no guarantee of ultimate victory. Around them, servo skulls drifted between treatment stations where other Death Guard received care for wounds that were straightforward by comparison. Severed limbs that could be replaced, organ damage that could be repaired, nerve trauma that could be treated through established protocols. Mortarion's condition offered no such simple solutions because it represented something unprecedented in the Legiones Astartes' long history. Other psychers had burned themselves out through overuse of their abilities, but those cases involved exhaustion that could be remedied through rest and proper treatment. What consumed the Death Guard Primarch was different, a power that demanded payment, not in temporary weakness, but in permanent diminishment of everything that defined his essential nature. The irony was not lost on anyone present. Mortarion had always been the most physically resilient of his brothers, the Primarch whose constitution could endure toxins that would kill other Space Marines within seconds. His legendary toughness had made him effective on worlds where simple exposure to the atmosphere would prove fatal to unprotected humans. Now, that same incredible durability was being consumed from within by forces that viewed physical strength as fuel to be burned rather than capacity to be preserved. How long? Garrow asked the question that none of them wanted answered, yet all needed to understand. At current rates of deterioration, how much time does he have before? Vadon consulted readings that fluctuated with each breath his patient drew. If he continues channeling purifying flames at the intensity we witnessed during yesterday's fighting, perhaps weeks. If he moderates usage, conserves his strength for only the most critical moments, possibly months. But every calculation assumes he will cease using these abilities entirely, which we both know he will never accept. The assessment carried weight beyond medical prognosis because it spoke to character traits that had defined Mortarion since his youth on Barbarous. The Primarch who had chosen to climb the highest peaks alone, who had faced the overlords without backup or support, who had purged his own fleet rather than accept corruption. Such a warrior would never choose preservation of self over protection of others. As if summoned by their conversation, Mortarion's eyes opened with the deliberate focus of one who had been feigning unconsciousness to avoid discussions he preferred not to engage. His pale gaze swept the medical chamber, taking in the concerned expressions of his sons and the medical equipment that painted an accurate picture of his deteriorating condition. "How much of that did I hear?" he asked, his voice carrying the dry humor that had sustained him through 2 centuries of warfare. "Enough to understand that you've been discussing my mortality, as though I were not present to offer my own perspective on the subject." Garrow's relief at seeing his Primarch conscious warred with frustration at behavior that prioritized duty over self-preservation. "My lord, the Medici reports indicate that continued use of your abilities will prove fatal within a time frame measured in weeks rather than years. Perhaps if you could moderate the intensity, find ways to channel purifying flames that demand less from your essential reserves." Mortarion sat up slowly, his movements carrying none of the fluid grace that had once characterized a Primarch's every gesture. The effort required to achieve vertical posture spoke of weakness that went deeper than mere physical exhaustion, yet his expression remained composed as he considered the tactical implications of his own mortality. "Tell me about the siege," he said, deflecting conversation from personal concerns toward strategic necessities that demanded immediate attention. "What has transpired during my medical consultation? Do our lines still hold? Are the Death Guard maintaining their effectiveness against Nurgle's forces?" The redirect was transparent but effective, shifting focus from individual welfare to collective survival. Garrow provided a concise briefing on developments during the hours his Primarch had been unconscious, enemy probing attacks that had been repulsed, defensive improvements that had been implemented, intelligence assessments about likely targets for the next major assault. Through it all, Mortarion listened with the intensity of a commander who understood that his personal condition was merely one variable in calculations that would determine whether Terra's defense could be maintained. His occasional nods suggested approval for decisions made in his absence, confidence in subordinates who had proven capable of independent action when circumstances demanded it. The Pale Wardens performed exceptionally during the night fighting, Garrow concluded his report. Captain Erlen led a counterattack that eliminated a demon engine that had breached the secondary perimeter. His warriors showed no hesitation when facing enemies that existed partially outside reality, no degradation in coordination, despite the supernatural terror projected by their opponents. Mortarion's satisfaction with the report was evident despite physical weakness that made simple conversation an effort that required conscious will to maintain. Good. They have learned to fight as we intended, using purity as a weapon rather than simply enduring corruption as an obstacle. When the next assault comes, they will be ready to face whatever horrors Typhus brings against us. Yet even as he spoke of future battles, all present could see the cost that past engagements had exacted from their commander. Mortarion's hair, once the color of twilight clouds, now showed streaks of premature white that spoke of years consumed in hours. His skin, pale even by the standards of his homeworld's toxic environment, had taken on a translucent quality that suggested substance being gradually worn away from within. Most telling were his hands, the instruments that channeled purifying flames with such devastating effect against corruption. The Primarch's fingers showed fine tremors that he could not entirely suppress, involuntary movements that spoke of nervous system damage that proceeded according to principles no medical training covered. When he gripped objects, the effort required concentration that should have been unnecessary for enhanced physiology, designed to function under impossible stress. "There is something you need to understand," Mortarion said, after dismissing the medical staff to continue their duties elsewhere. His words were directed to Garrow alone, carrying the weight of confessions shared between warriors who had faced death together on dozen worlds. "The power that flows through me is not mine to control in any conventional sense. It responds to need rather than desire, manifesting when corruption threatens what I have sworn to protect." The admission revealed depths of the sacrifice that others could only guess at from external observation. Mortarion was not choosing when and how to use abilities that consumed his essential nature. Instead, those abilities operated according to their own imperatives, drawing upon his life force whenever circumstances demanded intervention against supernatural corruption. Each time corruption appears within the Death Guard battle lines, the flames respond automatically, he continued, his voice growing softer as he described experiences that few mortals could comprehend. When demon influence seeks to claim our warriors, when plague spirits attempt to possess our equipment, when reality itself begins to warp under pressure from warp-spawned forces, the purifying fire emerges without conscious direction, burning away threats along with portions of whatever I once was. Garrow listened with growing understanding of the true scope of his Primarch's sacrifice. This was not heroic self-destruction chosen for dramatic effect, but slow consumption demanded by circumstances that offered no alternative. Mortarion was being devoured by his own righteousness, consumed by the very power that made him effective against enemies no conventional weapon could touch. "Can you not resist it?" Garrow asked, though he suspected the question revealed his own failure to grasp principles that operated beyond tactical calculation. "Choose not to channel the flames. Preserve your strength for battles where their use might prove decisive rather than merely convenient." Mortarion's smile carried sadness that spoke of understanding purchased through suffering that few could imagine. "Would you ask a father not to defend his children when they face annihilation?" Could you stand by and watch as corruption claims warriors whose only crime was loyalty to principles that transcend individual survival? The flames respond to love, Nathaniel, to connections that run deeper than strategic calculation or tactical advantage. The explanation revealed the fundamental nature of the power that was consuming its wielder from within. This was not psychic ability in any conventional sense, but something that operated according to emotional rather than intellectual principles. The purifying flames manifested whenever those Mortarion loved faced threats he could prevent, regardless of personal cost or strategic consequences. The irony, Mortarion continued, his words taking on the contemplative tone of one who had accepted inevitabilities that others still struggled to comprehend, is that the more purely I love my sons, the more completely the flames consume whatever remains of my original self. Each act of protection diminishes my capacity for future protection, each salvation purchased with currency I can never recover. The conversation was interrupted by alerts that indicated renewed enemy activity along the defensive perimeter. Mortarion rose from the medical table, with movements that spoke of determination, overcoming physical limitation, his will imposing order on a body that had begun to fail under supernatural strain. The transformation from patient to commander was immediate and complete, weakness set aside in favor of duty that demanded immediate attention. "My lord," Garrow began, clearly intending to suggest that others could handle whatever crisis had developed, that rest and recovery should take precedence over personal involvement in tactical situations. "No," Mortarion interrupted with finality that brooked no argument. "The Death Guard fight because they believe their sacrifice serves purposes greater than individual survival. How can I ask them to face corruption and death if I am unwilling to pay the same price for the same reasons? We stand together, or we fall separately, but we do not preserve leaders at the expense of those they are meant to protect." The words carried echoes of the Primarch, who had once climbed Barbaros's highest peaks alone, driven by commitment to ideals that transcended personal safety or comfort. Yet now those same principles operated in service to others rather than individual achievement, heroism redefined through sacrifice that benefited everyone except the one making it. As alarm klaxons sounded throughout the defensive complex and Death Guard warriors rushed to their battle stations, Mortarion prepared for another engagement that would demand everything he had to give, and more besides. Around him, his sons moved with confidence, born from knowing their Primarch would shield them from corruption, regardless of personal cost. That confidence was purchased with currency that could never be repaid, bought with sacrifices that diminished the one making them, while strengthening everyone they protected. The price of purity had been established through battles already fought, terms negotiated in moments of desperate need when alternatives offered only different forms of damnation. Now payment continued according to schedules that operated beyond mortal control, collecting interest that would eventually claim everything while providing protection that made such costs worthwhile. The Death Guard advanced toward whatever fresh horrors awaited them, shielded by love that burned brighter than any flame their enemies could conjure. Behind them, in medici chambers where monitors recorded the gradual dissolution of one who chose others over self, the true cost of heroism continued its relentless accounting. Some prices were worth paying regardless of their ultimate consequences. Time would determine whether this was wisdom or folly, but for now it was enough that the choice had been made and was being honored through actions that transformed individual sacrifice into collective salvation. Brothers' War, the Palatine Arc, had once been the jewel of the Imperial Palace's outer districts, its crystalline spires reaching toward Terra's polluted sky like fingers grasping for stars that had long since been obscured by the smoke of war. Now those same towers lay shattered across streets that ran red with the blood of defenders who had held their positions until the very stone beneath their feet cracked under supernatural pressure. In the ruins of what had been humanity's most beautiful architectural achievement, 3 brothers prepared to settle accounts that stretched back to the earliest days of the Great Crusade. Mortarion stood amid the wreckage of a fountain that had once celebrated the Emperor's vision of human unity, his pale form wreathed in flames that burned away the corruption seeping from cracks in reality itself. The purifying fire that danced around him cast no shadows, instead seeming to devour the very concept of darkness wherever its radiance fell. Yet those who knew him well could see the cost such manifestations demanded. The Primarch's movements carried stiffness that spoke of joints grinding against bone, while his breathing came in measured intervals that suggested lungs operating at diminished capacity. "Brother," called a voice that had once inspired loyalty across 1,000 battlefields, but now carried harmonics that made mortal listeners weep blood from their ears. Angron descended from the ruins of a collapsed spire, his massive form no longer recognizably human, despite retaining the basic configuration that marked him as one of the Emperor's sons. The Red Angel had embraced Khorne's gifts so completely that brass and bone had fused with flesh to create something that existed as much in the immaterium as the material realm. "The Pale One still clings to illusions of purity," Angron continued, his words accompanied by the sound of skulls grinding beneath feet that left molten footprints in adamantium flooring. "How amusing that our most toxic brother believes himself cleansed when he has merely traded one form of poison for another. Your flames burn as hot as any rage, Mortarion. The blood god finds such passion intriguing." The taunt carried weight beyond mere psychological warfare because it spoke to truth that Mortarion had wrestled with since first manifesting his purifying abilities. The power that flowed through him did indeed burn with intensity that approached fury, consuming everything it touched while claiming to serve noble purposes. Yet the Death Guard Primarch had learned to distinguish between passion that served others and rage that served only itself. "I remember when we fought together, brother," Mortarion replied, his voice carrying sorrow for what had been lost alongside determination about what must be preserved. "Your courage inspired warriors who had given up hope. Your fury broke enemies that conventional weapons could not touch. But what stands before me now is not Angron of the World Eaters, but a puppet that dances to the tune of powers that view honor as weakness." A second voice joined the conversation, its tones carrying musical qualities that would have been beautiful if they had not been accompanied by harmonics that suggested pleasures too intense for mortal flesh to survive. Fulgrim emerged from shadows that moved independently of any light source, his perfect features unmarred despite corruption that had transformed every other aspect of his being into something that served purposes no loyal son would acknowledge. "How dramatic you have become, dear Mortarion," the Phoenician said, his words dripping with amusement that cut deeper than any blade. "Once you were content to endure in silence, accepting whatever toxins the universe provided, while maintaining that grim stoicism that made you so predictable. Now you speak of honor and nobility as though such concepts held meaning beyond the pleasure they provide when properly corrupted." The arrival of both corrupted Primarchs in the same location was no coincidence, but rather the result of coordination that spoke to strategic planning at the highest levels. Horus had learned from the failure of previous assaults against the Death Guard's positions, understanding that conventional corruption could not breach defenses built around principles that operated according to different rules than those governing normal warfare. You seek to overwhelm through numbers what you could not defeat through individual effort, Mortarion observed, his tactical assessment delivered with the calm precision of a commander who had faced impossible odds throughout 2 centuries of warfare. Yet you mistake quantity for quality, coordination for true unity. Whatever bonds once existed between us have been severed by choices that transformed brothers into enemies. The battle that followed defied every convention of warfare that Mortarion had learned during the Great Crusade's golden years. This was not conquest fought for territory or strategic advantage, but personal combat waged between beings whose individual power could reshape the very nature of reality around them. Each blow exchanged carried force sufficient to crack continental plates, while the mere presence of 3 primarchs locked in mortal combat created distortions that made the laws of physics suggestions rather than absolute principles. Angron attacked with fury that transcended mere rage, his blows powered by energies drawn directly from the warp's most violent currents. Where his weapons found purchase, they left wounds that burned with supernatural fire, injuries that sought to corrupt the very concept of healing, while inflicting pain that operated on spiritual as well as physical levels. The Red Angel's assault was relentless, each strike intended not simply to damage, but to break the will that allowed resistance to continue. Yet Mortarion had learned to fight according to principles that his brother could not comprehend. Instead of meeting fury with fury, the Death Guard Primarch channeled defensive techniques that transformed Angron's rage into fuel for his own purifying flames. Each attack that connected fed energy into barriers that grew stronger under pressure, creating a paradox where aggression served the defender rather than the attacker. Fulgrim's approach was altogether different, employing tactics that sought to corrupt through seduction rather than domination through force. The Phoenician's blade work was flawless in its technical execution, each movement a masterpiece of martial perfection that would have been beautiful to witness if it had not been accompanied by influences that sought to make observers complicit in their own destruction. "You fight so desperately to preserve what you have become," Fulgrim said, as his blade carved patterns in the air that left after-images on mortal retinas. Yet you refuse to acknowledge that purity itself is merely another form of sensation, another experience to be savored and transcended. Why limit yourself to such narrow definitions of righteousness when perfection offers so much more? The Phoenician's words carried psychic weight that sought to plant seeds of doubt in minds that had been hardened against conventional corruption. His argument was seductive precisely because it contained elements of truth. Purity could indeed become its own form of obsession, righteousness its own variety of pride. Yet Mortarion had learned to recognize the difference between self-improvement that served others and perfection that served only itself. "Because," Mortarion replied, as silence carved through defenses that should have been impregnable, "true strength comes not from experiencing everything, but from choosing what deserves experience. Not all sensations are worth pursuing, not all perfections worth achieving. Some paths lead to growth, while others lead only to consumption that mistakes appetite for wisdom." The 3-way combat that raged through the ruins of the Palatine Arc created spectacles that would have been impossible to witness under normal circumstances. Mortarion's purifying flames met Angron's rage-fueled assaults in displays of light and shadow that redefined the very concepts of illumination and darkness. Fulgrim's perfect movements clashed with defensive techniques that operated according to principles the Phoenician could no longer comprehend, creating patterns of force that carved new geometries into the fundamental structure of local space. Yet for all his skill and determination, Mortarion found himself gradually being overwhelmed by opponents who fought without regard for personal cost or collateral damage. The corrupted Primarchs drew power from sources that seemed inexhaustible, while his own abilities demanded payment in currency he could ill afford to expend. Each manifestation of purifying flame diminished his reserves further, bringing him closer to the ultimate exhaustion that would render him defenseless against enemies who showed no mercy and understood no restraint. It was then that salvation arrived in the form of laughter that carried joy rather than madness, speed that served protection rather than destruction. Jagatai Khan emerged from the ruins of a collapsed transport tunnel, his white armor bearing scars from recent battles, but his movements still carrying the fluid grace that made the White Scars masters of rapid warfare. "Brothers," the Khan called, as his tulwar carved through the air with deadly precision, "surely you have not forgotten the most important lesson of our youth, that when faced with impossible odds, the wise warrior calls for backup rather than attempting to prove individual superiority through glorious death. The great Khan's intervention changed the fundamental dynamics of the engagement from overwhelming assault against isolated defender to complex multi-way battle where alliances and betrayals could shift with each exchange of blows. Jagatai's speed allowed him to support Mortarion's defense while avoiding direct confrontation with either corrupted brother, creating opportunities for the Death Guard Primarch to recover while ensuring that neither Angron nor Fulgrim could focus their full attention on a single target. "The running dog joins the dying corpse," Angron snarled as he adjusted his assault pattern to account for the new threat. How fitting that cowards should band together when faced with warriors who have embraced their true nature without reservation or shame. Yet the Red Angel's taunt carried less conviction than before, because the Khan's presence had introduced tactical complications that even rage-enhanced perception struggled to process effectively. Jagatai fought with techniques that prioritized mobility over direct confrontation, using the terrain of rubble and collapsed architecture to create angles of attack that forced his opponents to divide their attention between multiple threats. "True nature," the Khan replied, as his blade found gaps in Angron's brass-enhanced armor, "is not what we become when we surrender to our worst impulses, but what we choose to be despite the temptations that surround us. You have not embraced strength, brother, but traded it away for power that belongs to others." The renewed battle saw Mortarion and Jagatai working in coordination that spoke to bonds forged during the Great Crusade's earliest campaigns. The Death Guard Primarch's purifying flames created zones of protection that allowed the Khan to operate at maximum effectiveness, while his brother's speed prevented their enemies from concentrating overwhelming force against Mortarion's increasingly fragile defenses. Together, they began to push back against corruption that had seemed unstoppable when faced individually. Mortarion's flames burned away the supernatural enhancements that made Angron's rage inexhaustible, while Jagatai's bladework carved through illusions that made Fulgrim's perfection seem unassailable. Most importantly, their cooperation demonstrated that loyalty could match corruption, blow for blow, when properly coordinated and intelligently applied. The climax came when Mortarion channeled purifying fire with intensity that surpassed anything he had previously achieved, drawing upon reserves he had not known he possessed to create a conflagration that burned away not just corruption, but the very possibility of corruption in the space around him. The flames that erupted from his form were no longer golden, but white-hot radiance that made looking directly at him impossible for any mortal eye. Angron and Fulgrim, caught in the full force of purification that operated according to principles their patrons could not counter, screamed with voices that carried pain across dimensions. The Red Angel's brass enhancements cracked and fell away like shed skin, while the Phoenician's perfect features showed scars that would never heal completely. Both corrupted Primarchs retreated, their forms flickering between material and immaterial existence as they struggled to maintain cohesion under assault that attacked the very foundations of their transformed nature. "This is not over," Fulgrim called as he faded into shadows that provided escape rather than concealment. "Purity cannot be maintained forever, brother. Eventually, you will exhaust yourself, and when that moment comes, we will be waiting." Angron's retreat was less elegant, but equally final, the Red Angel simply vanishing into the warp's currents with a roar of frustration that shattered windows across several city blocks. His parting words carried promises of return and revenge that would have been more threatening if they had not been accompanied by evidence of genuine injury inflicted by forces he could neither understand nor effectively counter. Standing amid the wreckage of what had been the Palatine Ark's heart, Mortarion and Jagatai surveyed destruction that spoke to powers unleashed beyond any conventional measure. The Death Guard Primarch's victory had come at costs that were immediately apparent. His pale skin now carried a translucent quality that suggested essence burned away in pursuit of tactical advantage, while his movements showed exhaustion that went deeper than mere physical fatigue. "You cannot continue fighting at such intensity," Jagatai observed, with the blunt honesty that characterized all his communications. "Each battle demands more than you can afford to give, each victory purchased with currency that brings you closer to ultimate defeat. There must be another way to achieve what you seek." Mortarion's smile carried sadness that spoke of understanding purchased through sacrifice that few could imagine. Perhaps. But today was not about sustainability or long-term planning. Today was about proving that corruption can be defeated when faced with sufficient determination and proper support. My brothers learned that their gifts are not unlimited, their patron gods not unbeatable. The victory was real but temporary, a demonstration of possibility rather than permanent solution. Yet in a war where hope had become a scarce commodity, even temporary triumph carried weight beyond its immediate tactical implications. The galaxy had witnessed 2 corrupted Primarchs retreat before powers they could not comprehend, principles they could not corrupt, love they could not transform into instruments of their own purposes. The siege continued, the war raged on, and the future remained uncertain. But for one shining moment in the ruins of humanity's greatest architectural achievement, purity had proven stronger than corruption, brotherhood more powerful than individual ambition, choice more enduring than compulsion. The cost would be calculated later. For now, it was enough that the calculation remained possible at all. The Pale King's last stand. The Saturnine Gate had become a monument to defiance, written in adamantium and blood, its massive fortifications scarred by weapons that should not have existed in any sane universe. For 72 hours, Mortarion and his Death Guard had held the critical choke point against waves of corruption that broke against purified steel like ocean waves against unyielding cliffs. The cost had been terrible. Nearly half his remaining warriors lay dead or dying in the medici stations behind the lines, yet the gate remained in Imperial hands. Mortarion stood atop the gate's highest rampart, watching as another demon horde assembled in the ruins of what had once been Terra's commercial district. His enhanced vision could make out individual creatures spawned in the warp's deepest reaches, abominations that served purposes no mortal mind should contemplate. At their head marched figures that had once been space marines, their corrupted forms now serving as vessels for entities that regarded honor as weakness and loyalty as folly. The Primarch's condition had deteriorated visibly during the siege's most intense phase. His pale skin had taken on an almost translucent quality that suggested substance being gradually consumed from within, while his movements required conscious effort that should have been unconscious reflex. Each manifestation of purifying flame demanded payment in currency he could no longer afford to spend freely, yet alternatives offered only different forms of defeat. "My lord," Captain Garrow reported from his position at the tactical display, his scarred features showing exhaustion that went deeper than mere physical fatigue. Long-range auguries detect massive energy build-up aboard the Vengeful Spirit. Our astropaths report unusual activity in the warp. Something significant is about to occur. Mortarion felt the disturbance as a pressure against his enhanced senses, a gravitational pull that operated according to psychic rather than physical principles. Through his connection to the imperium, he could perceive currents of power converging around Horus's flagship like stellar matter spiraling into a black hole. Whatever was happening aboard that vessel would reshape the very nature of the conflict that had torn the galaxy apart. The revelation came through channels that bypassed conventional communication entirely. Across Terra's ravaged surface, every psyker simultaneously received the same impossible knowledge. The Emperor himself had teleported to the Vengeful Spirit for direct confrontation with the son who had chosen damnation over duty. The Master of Mankind had abandoned his position, coordinating Terra's defense to face Horus in single combat that would determine humanity's ultimate fate. The news struck the Saturnine Gate's defenders like a physical blow. Warriors who had maintained discipline under impossible pressure suddenly found themselves staring at tactical displays that showed their supreme commander's absence from all Imperial positions. The Emperor's departure left a void in both strategic coordination and spiritual guidance that threatened to collapse morale more effectively than any daemon assault. "He has gone to face Horus alone," Mortarion said, his words carrying certainty, born from understanding that transcended conventional intelligence gathering. The final confrontation that was always inevitable has begun aboard the War Master's flagship. What happens there will determine whether this siege ends in triumph or catastrophe. The statement hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Around him, Death Guard officers who had never shown fear in the face of creatures spawned in nightmare suddenly appeared uncertain, their confidence shaken by awareness that their Primarch's father fought alone against enemies whose power had grown beyond all reasonable measure. It was then that Mortarion made the decision that would define everything he had become since first rejecting Nurgle's gifts in the fleet's darkest hour. The Emperor faced Horus without support, confronting a son whose corruption had transformed him into something that might prove capable of achieving the unthinkable. If the Master of Mankind fell, if the golden dream of human unity died aboard the Vengeful Spirit, then everything they had fought to preserve would crumble regardless of how many gates they held. "Nathaniel," Mortarion said, turning to address the captain who had served at his side through transformation that had redefined the very nature of duty itself. "You will assume command of the Saturnine Gate's defenses. Hold this position against whatever comes. Do not yield a single meter of ground. Do not allow corruption to gain any foothold within these walls. My sons deserve to know their sacrifices served purposes greater than individual survival. Garrow's expression showed understanding, mixed with desperate hope that his Primarch might reconsider a choice that appeared to offer only one possible outcome. My lord, your presence here has been the keystone that maintains our defense. Without your purifying flames, without the protection you provide against spiritual corruption, this position cannot be held against the forces arrayed against us. The observation was tactically accurate, but failed to account for principles that transcended battlefield calculations. Mortarion had learned through bitter experience that some duties demanded acceptance of personal cost, regardless of strategic implications. His father faced annihilation alone, while his sons died defending gates that would prove meaningless if the Emperor fell to corruption given form. You have learned to channel purification through discipline rather than desperation, Mortarion replied, his words carrying confidence in warriors who had proven themselves capable of growth beyond their original limitations. The techniques I taught you operate according to principles that any sufficiently motivated warrior can master, given proper instruction and genuine commitment. Trust in what you have become, not in what you once were. The Primarch moved to the gate's central shrine, where he had placed equipment that would allow him to follow the Emperor's path through dimensions that existed between heartbeats. The teleportation array had been salvaged from a damaged Imperial fist vessel, its machine spirit purified and rededicated to purposes that served protection rather than conquest. Using it would require channeling purifying flames with intensity that would consume whatever remained of his essential nature, yet alternatives offered only the certainty of arriving too late to effect outcomes that would reshape the galaxy's future. Tell my sons this, Mortarion said, as golden fire began to dance around his form with radiance that made direct observation impossible, that their Primarch died as he lived after his awakening, in service to principles greater than individual survival, defending those who could not defend themselves, choosing duty over comfort, even when that choice demanded everything he had to give. The teleportation itself was agony beyond description, requiring Mortarion to tear holes in reality while protecting his essential nature from forces that sought to corrupt anything they touched. The journey through the warp's chaotic currents was brief but transformative, burning away portions of his consciousness while delivering him to coordinates that existed both in physical space and spiritual dimension. He materialized in the throne room of the vengeful spirit to witness a tableau that would haunt whatever time remained to him. The Emperor knelt bleeding before the golden throne that Horus had claimed as his rightful inheritance, his golden armor cracked and his perfect features marked by wounds that spoke to battles fought on multiple levels simultaneously. Above him stood the War Master, no longer recognizably the son who had once inspired loyalty across the galaxy, but something that wore familiar flesh while serving purposes that belonged to entities older than human civilization. "Father," Horus was saying, his voice carrying harmonics that made the very air weep with sorrow for innocence lost. You could have avoided this pain by simply acknowledging what you always knew to be true, that your dream of human unity was nothing more than tyranny disguised as benevolence. Now you will witness the birth of something greater than the stagnant empire you sought to impose upon beings who deserved freedom. The Emperor's response was barely audible, his words emerging through lips that wept golden blood onto deck plates that had been sanctified to serve purposes no loyal soul should acknowledge. "My son, what have they done to you?" It was then that Mortarion stepped forward, his form wreathed in purifying flames that burned with intensity drawn from reserves he hadn't known he still possessed. The sight of his father broken and bleeding before a brother who had chosen damnation over duty ignited fury that transcended any emotion he had previously experienced. This was not rage born from personal grievance, but righteous anger that served purposes greater than individual satisfaction. "Brother!" Mortarion called, his voice carrying across the throne room with authority that made even corrupted space marines step back in recognition of power that operated according to different principles than those they served. "Your quarrel was never with our father alone, but with sons who chose different paths than the ones you offered. Face me instead, and learn whether corruption can stand against purity, when both are wielded by those willing to pay any price for victory." Horus turned toward his unexpected visitor, with eyes that held depths no mortal should contain, his perfect features twisting into expressions that belonged on no human face. The War Master had grown beyond the limitations that confined other Primarchs to merely superhuman capabilities, his bargains with chaos granting power that operated according to principles that transcended natural law. "Mortarion," Horus said, his words carrying amusement that cut deeper than any physical weapon. "The Pale King arrives at last, bearing gifts of purification to a celebration that has moved beyond such primitive concepts. How fitting that my most stubborn brother should witness the completion of work that began with your own refusal to embrace necessary evolution." The battle that followed was brief but decisive, operating simultaneously on physical and metaphysical levels as two opposed philosophies tested their strength against each other. Horus fought with power borrowed from entities whose existence predated the birth of stars, his attacks carrying corruption that sought to transform resistance into compliance. Mortarion countered with flames that represented everything he had become since first choosing redemption over damnation, each parry burning away influences that sought to make him complicit in his own destruction. Yet the Death Guard Primarch was already weakened beyond any reasonable measure, by battles that had demanded everything he possessed. And more besides, each manifestation of purifying fire drew from reserves that had been exhausted during the siege's most desperate hours, while Horus commanded power that seemed to increase with each moment of combat. The outcome was never in doubt, only the manner of its achievement and the price that would be extracted from both victor and defeated. The killing blow came as silence shattered against weapons forged from corrupted starlight, its fragments scattering across deck plates that drank the blood of heroes and spat out only despair. Mortarion fell with his father's name on his lips, his life ebbing away through wounds that burned with supernatural fire designed to prevent any possibility of healing or resurrection. Yet even in defeat, the Death Guard Primarch achieved something that neither Horus nor his patrons had anticipated. The purifying flames that had defined his transformation didn't die with his mortal form, but instead transferred to the Emperor, pouring into wounds that had been slowly killing the master of mankind through corruption too subtle to resist through conventional means. Golden radiance met purifying fire in fusion that created something unprecedented, power that belonged neither to chaos nor order, but to choice itself. The Emperor rose from his knees with strength that transcended his previous capabilities, his wounds sealing themselves, while his armor regained the luster that had once inspired loyalty across the galaxy. When he looked upon Horus, his eyes held sadness for what had been lost alongside determination about what must be preserved. "My son," the Emperor said, his voice carrying weight that made the vengeful spirit's hull groan under pressure that operated according to spiritual rather than physical principles. You have learned too late that power borrowed from others always demands payment that exceeds its apparent value. What you thought was strength was merely another form of slavery. Evolution, merely another word for surrender. The confrontation that followed was no longer between father and son, but between competing visions of what humanity could become. The Emperor, empowered by Mortarion sacrifice and purified by flames that burned away corruption without destroying the essential nature beneath, proved capable of matching power that Horus had believed unassailable. When the War Master finally fell, when his corrupted form crumbled to dust that scattered like memories of better days, the victory belonged as much to the Primarch who had died to make it possible as to the father who had lived to see it achieved. Standing over his fallen son's remains, while holding the body of another son who had died to preserve what Horus had sought to destroy, the Emperor understood that triumph had come at costs that could never be fully calculated or adequately mourned. Mortarion's sacrifice had saved not just the master of mankind's life, but the very possibility of human redemption in a universe where such concepts had seemed increasingly meaningless. The Siege of Terra would end with imperial victory, but it would be victory purchased with blood of heroes whose names would be remembered as long as humanity endured among the stars. Among those names, Mortarion of the Death Guard would hold a place of honor earned through choices that transformed personal suffering into collective salvation. The Pale King was dead, but his legacy would burn eternal in the hearts of those who understood that some prices were worth paying, regardless of their personal cost. In choosing duty over comfort, sacrifice over survival, love over power, he had proven that redemption remained possible, even in the darkest hours of the galaxy's long night. The war was won. The future remained uncertain. But hope, purchased with the life of one who had learned to value others above himself, would endure to light the way forward through whatever trials awaited humanity among the stars. For the Pale Throne. In the aftermath of victory that had cost more than anyone could have imagined, Terra lay broken beneath skies that wept ash from 1,000 funeral pyres. The siege of the Imperial Palace had ended not in triumph but in exhaustion, the defenders emerging from their fortifications like survivors of some cosmic shipwreck to survey destruction that would require centuries to repair. Among the ruins of humanity's greatest achievements, the Emperor of mankind stood beside a simple bier that held the remains of the son whose sacrifice had purchased survival for an entire species. Mortarion's body lay in state within the throne room of the Imperial Palace, his pale features finally at peace after decades of struggle that had redefined the very nature of duty itself. The purifying flames that had consumed him from within were gone, leaving behind only the shell of a Primarch who had chosen love over power, service over survival, redemption over the easy path of corruption. Around him, Death Guard warriors maintained honor vigil, with discipline that spoke to lessons learned through suffering that had transformed them into something unprecedented. The Emperor himself bore wounds that would never fully heal, his golden armor scarred by weapons that had sought to corrupt as well as destroy. Yet he lived when all calculations suggested he should have died, sustained by power that Mortarion had transferred in his final moments. The master of mankind's survival came at the cost of capabilities he would never regain, psychic abilities diminished by trauma that had pushed his consciousness beyond all reasonable limits. "He saved us all," the Emperor said, his words directed toward Captain Garrow and the surviving Death Guard officers who had assembled to pay final respects to their fallen Primarch. "Not just my life, not merely Terra's defense, But the very possibility of human redemption in a universe that had begun to regard such concepts as meaningless sentiment. Through his choices, Mortarion proved that even the fallen can rise again, that even the lost can find their way home. The funeral that followed was witnessed by representatives from across the Imperium, warriors and civilians who had come to understand that something fundamental had changed during the siege's darkest hours. This was not merely the burial of another Primarch, but the consecration of principles that would reshape how humanity approached its endless war against corruption. The ceremony took place in the Cathedral of the Savior Emperor, where stained glass windows told stories of heroes who had chosen sacrifice over personal glory. Yet even as terror mourned its dead, the work of rebuilding had already begun along lines that would have been impossible before Mortarion's transformation. The Death Guard, reduced to barely 3,000 warriors from their original strength of 50,000, found themselves elevated to positions of honor that reflected their unique capabilities rather than their numerical strength. They became the Imperium's first and greatest specialists in fighting corruption directly, their techniques studied and copied by organizations that had never imagined such knowledge could exist. Chief Librarian Esda of the Ultramarines was among the first to recognize the broader implications of what the Death Guard had achieved. Standing in the palace's great library where scholars worked to preserve Mortarion's teachings for future generations, he addressed an assembly of senior officers who would carry this knowledge to the furthest reaches of Imperial space. What we have witnessed transcends tactical innovation or strategic advantage, Esda said, his words carrying the weight of understanding purchased through witnessing impossibilities made manifest. The 14th Legion has developed methods that operate according to principles we are only beginning to comprehend. Their success against corruption suggests that the enemy's greatest strength, the inevitability of spiritual decay, may not be as absolute as we once believed. The Pale Codex, as Mortarion's teachings came to be known, represented more than military doctrine or technical manual. It was a philosophical treatise that addressed fundamental questions about the nature of choice and consequence in a universe where both gods and mortals sought to impose their will upon resistant reality. The document's pages covered everything from meditation techniques that strengthened resistance to psychic assault to tactical formations that maximized the effectiveness of purifying flames. Most importantly, the Codex established principles that any warrior could learn, given sufficient dedication and proper instruction. Purity was not a gift granted to the worthy, but a discipline that could be cultivated through practice and maintained through constant vigilance. Corruption could be fought not just by those with special abilities, but by anyone willing to choose principle over expedience when the moment of testing arrived. The establishment of the Pale Throne marked the formal recognition of Mortarion's legacy within Imperial doctrine. The shrine erected in his honor became more than a memorial to a fallen hero. It served as a training center where warriors from across the galaxy came to learn techniques that had proven effective against enemies that conventional weapons could not touch. The throne itself was carved from stone taken from Barbarous, its surface inscribed with the names of every Death Guard who had died in service to ideals that transcended individual survival. Captain Garrow assumed leadership of the reconstituted Death Guard with reluctance that spoke to understanding of the burden he had inherited. The legion he now commanded bore little resemblance to the toxic, resistant warriors who had once served in Horus's rebellion, yet their new identity carried weight that their original purpose had never achieved. They were no longer simply survivors, but active agents of purification who carried their Primarch's legacy to battles fought on worlds whose names would be remembered as long as humanity endured among the stars. We serve not as weapons of destruction, but as instruments of hope, Garrow told the assembled Death Guard during the first formal ceremony held in Mortarion's honor. Our Lord chose to transform personal suffering into collective salvation, individual sacrifice into universal possibility. That transformation continues through our actions, our choices, our willingness to pay whatever price duty demands. The years that followed saw the spread of Mortarion's teachings throughout the Imperium's military organizations. Space Marine chapters that had never considered fighting corruption directly began incorporating purification techniques into their training regiments. Imperial Guard regiments learned to resist spiritual contamination through disciplined application of principles that operated according to mental rather than physical conditioning. Most remarkably, ordinary citizens discovered that heroism was not limited to those born with superhuman capabilities, but available to anyone willing to choose others over self. The impact on imperial doctrine was profound and lasting. Where once corruption had been seen as inevitable consequence of exposure to chaos forces, now it was understood as challenge that could be met and overcome through proper preparation and unwavering commitment to principle. The enemy's greatest weapon, despair born from apparent hopelessness, lost much of its effectiveness when faced with evidence that alternatives existed to simple survival or inevitable damnation. Decades passed, then centuries, yet the Pale Throne continued to draw pilgrims from across the galaxy. They came seeking not miracle cures or divine intervention, but understanding of how choice could be maintained even under circumstances that seemed to offer only different forms of surrender. The shrine's archives contained testimonials from warriors who had faced impossible odds and discovered strength they had not known they possessed, civilians who had chosen death over cooperation with forces that regarded their souls as currency. Among these records, none carried more weight than the personal journal of a former word-bearer who had abandoned his legion's worship of chaos to seek redemption through service to principles that demanded everything, while promising nothing except the possibility of dying with dignity intact. His testimony spoke to possibilities that Mortarion's example had made manifest, that even the most thoroughly corrupted could find their way back to paths that served light rather than darkness. I came to the Pale Throne believing myself beyond redemption, the former traitor had written. My hands were stained with the blood of innocence, my soul marked by bargains that seemed impossible to break. Yet here I learned that redemption is not granted, but chosen, not received, but earned through actions that serve others, rather than self. The Pale King showed us that transformation is always possible for those willing to pay its price. The Emperor himself visited the shrine on the anniversary of Mortarion's death, his presence drawing crowds who came not to worship, but to witness living proof that the galaxy's darkest hour had not ended in despair. His words on these occasions were few, but carried weight that resonated through decades of imperial policy and military doctrine. My son chose the hardest path available to him, the Emperor said during one such commemoration. Not the comfort of certainty, not the ease of power borrowed from others, but the painful necessity of forging strength from principle and love. His legacy reminds us that nobility is not inherited but earned, that heroism is not granted but chosen, that hope is not given but created through actions that transform suffering into salvation. As the centuries passed and the Imperium faced new challenges that tested the limits of human endurance, the lessons of the Pale Throne proved their worth time and again. When the Black Crusades sought to overwhelm imperial defenses through mass corruption, Death Guard successors trained in Mortarion's techniques provided resistance that conventional forces could not achieve. When alien influences sought to subvert human colonies through spiritual contamination, warriors schooled in purification doctrine proved capable of cleansing entire worlds of threats that existed beyond the reach of physical weapons. Yet perhaps the most lasting impact was not military but philosophical. The understanding that even in a universe defined by endless war and spiritual corruption, choice remained possible for those willing to accept its responsibilities. Mortarion's example proved that individuals could shape their own destiny through decisions that transcended the apparent limitations imposed by circumstance or genetics. The Pale King had shown that redemption was not fairy tale, but achievable goal for anyone willing to choose others over self, duty over comfort, love over power. In the end, that may have been his greatest victory, not the tactical success that saved Terra or the strategic advantage that preserved the Imperium, but the demonstration that hope could be maintained even in circumstances that seemed to offer only different forms of despair. His throne remained empty, his body had long since returned to dust, yet his spirit lived on in every warrior who chose principle over expedience, every citizen who picked service over safety, every soul who discovered that some things were worth dying for, regardless of personal cost. The galaxy burned with the fires of eternal war, yet among those flames flickered lights that would not be extinguished. The Pale Throne stood testament to the truth that corruption was not inevitable, that damnation was not certain, that even gods could be defied by mortals who chose their path with full understanding of what such choices demanded. Mortarion was gone, but his legacy endured in the hearts of those who understood that some prices were worth paying, some sacrifices worth making, some principles worth defending regardless of their personal cost. In choosing love over power, he had transformed not just his own legion, but the very nature of what it meant to serve in an age when service itself had become a question rather than an answer. The Pale King was dead, yet in death he had achieved what few beings could accomplish in life. The knowledge that his choices mattered, his sacrifice had meaning, his love had transformed the universe in ways that would echo through eternity. That, perhaps, was victory enough for any soul, no matter how pale, no matter how broken, no matter how far they had traveled from the light they ultimately chose to serve.